our co-host is Rafael. He's not Bengali, but his wife's Bengali, so he's got a bit of Bangla blood in him.
So I'm Bengali.
He's Bangla by marriage, yeah?
Yeah.
So all of us are Bangladeshi. You could say pretty much, yeah.
I like, you can probably tell if you see me because I've gained like 15-20 kilos in the last, since I got married. Too much parts. So yeah.
That means Bobby's looking after you. Bobby's looking after you, and she's taking the precautionary steps for you not to get married again.
A fat husband is a happy husband. Yeah, it's interference, man. Oh, there it is.
It's good.
That could have been Bobby. That could have been Bobby listening into us, possibly.
Is it gone? Is it gone?
Can you hear me? Assalamu alaikum.
Alhamdulillah.
This is turning out to be some Lollywood dramas, you know that. But alhamdulillah, it's sorted. By the way, I'm in no rush. I've dedicated my whole night to you guys, so I'm here, my brothers.
Appreciate it. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. My name is Tanzim. I'm joined by my co-hosts Josh and Rafael, and I think this is probably our earliest podcast. Actually, no, me and Josh did an earlier one with Dr. Shadi, but 7 a.m. out here, alhamdulillah. Right now it's 8:45, but we've actually have a special guest with us. That's why we all woke up early today. He's a deputy editor of British Muslim news site 5 Pillars. He's also a blogger for the Huffington Post UK, a freelance contributor for Jazeera English, the Ceasefire Magazine, the Middle East Eye, and Foreign Policy Journal. Pretty amazing list there. I think your LinkedIn page will probably be pretty top notch. So, assalamu alaikum, Dilly Hussain, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers. Do people really use LinkedIn these days?
Yeah, it's really
I thought it's all
like
I thought it's all Insta. It's all Insta and Snap now, really.
for us, youth that trying to hit into the job market. I think LinkedIn is our go-to kind of place to.
Okay. All right. Yeah, LinkedIn's for like LinkedIn's for like them kind of like pretentious kind of wannabe professionals, but that's in the UK. Maybe it's different in Australia. I don't know.
Do you have a LinkedIn? We'll stalk you.
We'll set one up for it.
Yeah, I have a LinkedIn page, but I forgot the password, so I don't know how.
Yeah, it's also fake because even with the LinkedIn newsfeed, when I check it out, it's all these people trying to be motivational and like 3 steps to success: dedication, hard work, and it's all like the same rehash, but it's just different ways. It's
meh.
They get to work on the first day and they're just like collapsed on the desk with their hanging out of their shirt. And they've got this mad LinkedIn profile. It's like, I'm a punctual, professional, polite, and dignified worker.
And they have like this HD photo of themselves on it's like full, like they paid like $100.
Yeah, headshots.
Yeah, bro. Like admiring that. But yeah,
I've never really understood LinkedIn. When I was working at a law firm, Dio Valente Solicitors, I thought I'd give him a shout out. When I was a business director there for a year and a half, they said to me, the senior partner, he said, Diddy, you have to have a LinkedIn. I've never ever had a LinkedIn. I mean, who checks LinkedIn? He goes, other prospective employees. I goes, well, no, I'm not going to do it. So, by Qamar Rahman, if you're listening, thank you for making me open up my LinkedIn account. I've never used it. I've forgotten the password.
Subhanallah. So I think we were talking to you on a chat on Facebook before the episode, but it's pretty unique how you're Bengali, you're Sylheti. I don't know if we can call you Bengali, but you're Bengali anyway, and me and Josh are Bengali as well. Few members of Boys in the Cave behind the scenes are Bengali as well, and Rafael, like we mentioned, has a Bengali wife, so he has a bit of Bengali blood in him. So
he's Bengali by marriage.
Bengali by marriage, yeah.
Alhamdulillah. And what's the scene like for Bengalis in UK? Because obviously in Australia, it's a bit different. They're all like Tabligis and stuff. Is it the similar situation in UK as well?
No, I mean, perhaps if we were talking before the 1990s, yeah, they would probably, the vast majority would probably be inclined towards the kind of Tablighi or Deobandi kind of way of thought. However, Sylheti Bengalis or Sileti Bangladeshis, they make up around 90 to 95% in the UK. So rarely will you ever bump into a Bangladeshi from Dhaka or Rajshahi or Comilla or Chittagong. You just won't find them here. 95% of British Bangladeshis are from Sylhet. And then from that 95%, I think about 83% own the Indian restaurant industry. So all the Indian restaurants here, the vast majority of them are owned by Sylheti Bangladeshis. With regards to their kind of religious demographics, well, I'm going to make some sweeping generalizations here. So before the 90s, yes, they'll be inclined towards the more kind of Deobandi or Tablighi kind of, way of thinking. But things have drastically changed now. You will get Jamaati Bangladesh. Actually, no, they were there. They were here before the 90s as well, but they are far more prominent now. You get Bangladeshi Salafis, you get Bangladeshi brothers who are part of the Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and many of different other groups and movements. So yeah, I wouldn't categorize them all into one group. They're quite diverse. So yeah, that's the situation in Bangladesh.
A Bengali is like the. Just give me.
Like the.
Can you? Sorry, there was an echo in the background, but I'll just continue. But a Bengali is like the biggest minority in the UK, Delhi, or like in terms of.
No. So the largest religious minority in the UK and by and large in Europe are Muslims, and within the Muslim minority, Pakistanis make up the largest minority group, and then Bangladeshis.
In the UK, okay.
Yes, in the UK,
okay,
yeah.
Right. Because I think for like.
I mean, don't get me wrong, we're a very big, sizable minority, but I think our Pakistani brothers and sisters, they're a larger demographic here.
Go straight. Let's just delve into the Bangladesh, Pakistan, because we mentioned before the episode we wanted to talk to you about it. We might as well delve into it now since we are talking about Bangladeshis. Do you have some questions?
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh yeah, I was. We were looking at your most recent articles, Dilly, with regards to nationalism and the Pakistan-Bangladesh divide, and you wrote a piece on Pakistan as well. And it was just really interesting. Me and Tanzim were discussing it earlier. We were talking about like what you consider nationalism to be, and like the way in which, obviously, we know it's had such a detrimental effect on Muslim societies and countries. It's sort of like, where does the boundary stop? Where that's a person's culture and they have pride in their identity, as opposed to being like a vitriolic sort of over the top nationalism. Because I think Muslims, like in Sydney anyway, we all have a fair grasp of the idea that nationalism is like not something you should attach yourself
But
to.
it's almost a tagline. It's like nationalism is bad, and that's the extent to which.
Yeah, but we don't really negotiate like what's permitted within that, how much of your culture, this, that. Do you get what I mean, Dilly?
I get exactly what you mean, but I think we're entering more concerning times. We get more concerning times. We have prominent du'at and ulama, especially in the Western Hemisphere, in the Western world. There's one da'i, I won't mention by name, but I'm sure some listeners will be able to know who it is. They conflated, nationalism and patriotism with the Prophet ﷺ's pride in being from Banu Hashim and from Quraysh. And I've even had some conflations.
I think the Arab state?
Pardon?
Like, was this in regards to like the Saudi kingdom or something?
No, not at all. This was a very prominent sheikh from America who has a massive following, and
right.
And he made a conflation. He basically said that, look, what's the difference between having pride and izzah over your land or your country, and that which the Prophet ﷺ was proud of being from Quraysh, and then saying from Quraysh, Banu Hashim is the best of tribe. What is the difference between being proud of your people and your qawm and that of Prophet ﷺ? And I found that to be a very disingenuous stretch, a very desperate stretch to justify whether it be nationalism or patriotism. And I know those two are different things, but essentially, the part of the same thing. Now, in light of Bangladesh and Pakistan, look, for the listeners, there are many hadith from Prophet ﷺ where he spoke about asabiyya, and he spoke very harshly against it. And there are various variations of the hadith where Prophet ﷺ called it rotten, He compared it to the dung which a beetle rolls on, and there's even another variation which is very, very explicit, but I'm not going to say it. Where pardon?
Nation, as in
Yeah, asabi yani tribalism, and obviously a modern manifestation of it. A modern manifestation of it would be nationalism, to take an excessive pride and arrogance over the land which you are from or the tribe which you are from. And obviously, you have very micro and macro versions of asabiya, and the most prominent one in our day and age is obviously nationalism, which was essentially a European phenomenon, which then through the period of post-colonialism, or one could argue even during the period of colonialism, that nationalism spread like wildfire. And it has a very unique narrative from the European perspective. But it is and still remains a very alien concept in not just the Muslim majority world, but even the wider developing world, Africa, South America, and other places. But to go back to the issue of Bangladesh and Pakistan, the article that you're referring to, I believe, is the one which I wrote a couple of months ago, where I said Bangladesh and Pakistan's brotherhood needs a sincere or serious reflection. I think that's the piece you're talking about.
yeah. As in, it was a good article in how you looked at the sort of history and the formation of Bangladesh,
I
and
mean,
sort of like yeah.
after that article was published in Pakistan Today, which is one of the biggest English language national newspapers
Oh, really?
in Pakistan.
That's
Yeah,
I
so millions of
understand.
Pakistanis read that article, and I'm sure Bangladeshis read it. And I even had some feedback from some of my fellow motherland countrymen, and they called me Rajakar and sellout and all kinds of other words, but others understood it. And essentially, the point here is that look, after the partition of India, when East Bengal essentially became Bangladesh, East Pakistan, there were a consistent level of oppression, both economic, socio-political, from the central government in Islamabad. And this, and
Yeah,
many people they think that the oppression began in 1971 or in the weeks, months, and years that built up to 71, and that's untrue. There were cases of rice that was being, produced in Bangladesh, being sold for half the price in West Pakistan, and then Bangladeshi were being sold it, or East Pakistanis were being sold that same rice, which they farmed and they produced, for double the price that it was being sold in Pakistan. And that's just one example. There were even other examples of, when there were major floods and cyclones, how the central government in Islamabad responded to those natural disasters and the resources they allocated to it. Then there was the whole kind of, the censorship of what East Pakistan regarded as its Bengali heritage and culture. And there's a whole movement around language, which West Pakistan quite violently cracked down on. And that occurred in the late 50s and early 60s. Now, the point of my article was, to put it in short, was that it is an undeniable fact that the West Pakistan government at the time had committed heinous crimes against their brethren in East Pakistan. If we were to take a conservative estimate, 300,000 majority Muslims, East Pakistanis were killed, right? And that's a conservative estimate, right? Some commentators and historians number it up to 3 million. But let's just take the conservative estimate, 300,000. In Syria, 300,000 Muslims have been killed in the space of 7 years. We're talking about 300,000 Bangladeshis were killed in the space of 12 months, right? Entire villages burnt, massacred, mass rapes, mass graves. It was really horrific stuff. Now, what was born out of that was obviously a movement of independence, a movement which was frustrated with the lack of attention, focus, resources that West Pakistan, and essentially we were supposed to be one state here. Remember this as well. We were supposed to be one state here. And when Sheikh Mujibur Rahman took part in the elections of 1970, he won by a landslide. like East Pakistan and West Pakistan theoretically should have had a Bengali president, a prime minister. He won that election's landslide. But even the Islamic groups of West Pakistan, even Jamaat-e-Islam and others, they opposed that election results. And Zulfikar Bhutto, Ali Bhutto, he opposed those results. So what obviously then essentially happened was that a guerrilla movement began, and we started, resisting the West Pakistani occupation of East Pakistan. Now that's the history. That's the history. The history, one cannot deny that many, many, many Bengali Muslims of East Pakistan died. They were massacred in cold blood, right? And the justification that was, or the kind of the prevalent narrative of the time within military circles in West Pakistan was that your brothers and sisters are on the verge of apostating. They have apostated, and they're going to join the ranks with India, Hindu India. So therefore, we must go there and rectify the issue. That was the predominant narrative that was given to the lay soldiers. And of course, with the assistance of India later on, within the War of Independence, we managed to beat West Pakistan. And I feel uncomfortable using this kind of language. Wallahi, I'll be honest with you, my dear brothers. Personally speaking, I don't like this we, them, us in the context of the problem that happened in 1971 and before it. And, there's also this kind of conception that Pakistan is Bada Bhai and Bangladesh is Chota Bhai. And when you speak to some Pakistanis even today, they'll say, look, what happened in 71 was a squabble over two brothers. And obviously that winds a lot of Bangladeshis up naturally, especially the older generation. What are you talking about? Chota Bhai, Bada Bhai. What, Bada Bhai decided to massacre hundreds and thousands of people? Is this the treatment of our Bada Bhai? So there is this element of, even till today, that Pakistan, whether it be the government or academic circles, they are yet to publicly acknowledge the enormity of the oppression and the massacres and the killings that took place. However, in my article, what I addressed was that Bangladesh or Bangladeshis need to move away from this kind of inferiority complex, and this kind of bitter hatred that we have for Pakistanis, right? You have to appreciate that our brothers and sisters who we know today, friends, peers, colleagues, some family members, neighbors, they are not responsible for what their forefathers did. We can never have that kind of mentality. They were not responsible for it.
Yeah, and I wanted to sort of link this back to.
And just on a last point, my dear brothers, and similarly, our Pakistani brothers and sisters need to do away with this kind of superiority complex that many of them have, based on my limited observations and experiences. And I've been raised with Pakistanis all my life. Brothers and sisters from Azad Jammu Kashmir, from Jhelum, from Pindi, from Lahore. I've been raised with them all my life, right? My family members are married into them. We're part of their very community, right? They need to get over this kind of, the Bangladeshis or the Bengalis or the Bengalans are our Chota brothers and they are physically inferior. And all those kind of racial stereotypes pertaining to skin color and what we eat. We need to do away with those kind of things. Because those things, they build up. And beyond the dal, roti, pan, machi jokes, there is deep inner issues that need to be addressed. And that's why I said that this brotherhood that does exist and has existed, it needs a serious reflection.
I wanted to look into how that links back to nationalism then, because I don't know, I feel like although like a lot of our more like more radical discourse of Muslims, like we understand that nationalism is like haram and you shouldn't be overly zealous about where you're from, that sort of thing.
Before you go on, I'm gonna quickly add in a story because reason why 1971 hits close to home for me especially is because my mom tells me stories, and even my grandparents about what happened. Because my mom was born, because they were liberated in 1971, gained independence. My mom was born in 1973, and her name's Mukti. I think in Bangla it means
freedom.
excuse me, freedom or something. So
Freedom.
and my
Mukti Mahoney.
Yeah, and my grandparents, they told me how they went on a boat and tried to escape, and like they risked all their lives to kind of move away from the situation that was, occurring in Bangladesh. And to this day, like fine, like whatever happened, we try to move on. But Bangladesh as a whole is so nationalistic, and even with Bengalis in the West, it's so nationalistic where the deen is lost because of 1971 essentially, because they've lost hope in one Ummah that Pakistan is meant to have their back because of all the massacres and atrocities that occurred by their Muslim brothers. So I guess even for my generation, even though I wasn't there or I didn't see it in my own eyes, we still have effects of that, of what occurred to this day, and it kind of filters through to us. But yeah, what did you want to mention, Josh?
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, so like we like I don't know, like in Islamic discourse, we tend to think of nationalism as like one category that different nations have and is equally wrong. But I feel like it sort of comes out of different things, different like events in history. For example, the Pakistani nationalism, for example, it comes out of a very like aggrandizing military pomp, like in a way that's very sort of perverted. It's like aggressiveness. Whereas for Bangladesh, like our nationalism comes out of like a history of like oppression and atrocity and love of language, which we were like forced to stop speaking. And so it's like it has a totally different basis. So I feel like we need to put that into consideration, that not all nationalisms have a very that same basis that the European nations had of like military advancement and like imperial like
For
domination.
sure.
That's how it
Look,
started.
absolutely.
But like a lot of the post-colonial nations, it's more about solidarity and more about like standing up for your people, and like it's more in line with what you were saying, like having pride that you're from this tribe, like how the Prophet ﷺ had pride in Banu Quraysh, as opposed to like I don't know the ill effects of nationalism. Do you get what I mean? As in, I think there should be
Okay,
a
then. Okay, let's run a little test here. Then let's run a little test here. Mention. Let's look at a couple of countries stretching from Morocco all the way to Indonesia, right?
yeah
And Muslim majority countries. And if we look at their independence, many of them, their independence was born out of fighting European colonizers.
yep
Others were born out of genuine cases of oppression, Bangladesh being one example. Others were born, and there's not many of them, others were born out of a strong sense of military independence, religious identity, Pakistan being one example.
yeah
But whilst sentiments can be justified, sentiments over belonging, pride, izzah, where it then starts very quickly delving into the realm of haram and prohibition is how that identity then dictates your worldview and your attitudes towards your brothers and sisters from other parts of the Muslim world. And that's what we have to look at here. So whilst we can understand fully, like I fully understand why millions upon millions of Bangladeshis would be proud of their country and be proud of this struggle against this oppressive West Pakistan government or country or state, which was essentially supposed to be the same state as them, right?
Yeah.
However, if you look at what very quickly happened, and what quickly happened after 1971 when the new Bangladesh was born, was that we essentially moved from being colonized by West Pakistan to then essentially becoming a proxy state for India, right? And even till today, right? We had the Shahbag protests 4 or 5 years ago. And even today in Bangladesh, when you talk about anything pertaining to Islam in the political realm, it starts getting attributed to Pakistan. I don't know if you guys know this or have experienced this. I have. Whenever you talk about anything Islamic and political, if you're not Jamati, who are anyway seen as Pakistani agents, even today, right? But it doesn't matter which movement, which group, which line of thinking in terms of resistance or revival that you are from, any kind of Islam that delves into the political and the public is somehow attributed to Pakistan, which then resonates within people that this is an oppressive form. Because they would say, well, hold on, this is what the West Pakistanis used to say to us when we were East Pakistan, that we are brothers, we're Muslims, we're one state. Yet look how they treated us. So what I'm saying is, once I appreciate the sentiments, I understand the sentiments of the Algerians, the Egyptians. I appreciate the sentiments of a number of Muslim majority countries who were born out of fighting European colonizers.
Yeah.
But then what happens is that asabiya, that nationalism, is then cemented into the psyche of the people. And then what then happens is that their worldview, their behaviorisms, their attitudes towards fellow Muslims then changes drastically. And then that becomes un-Islamic.
Yeah.
So whilst I appreciate the sentiments, the manifestation of those sentiments and what then turns out to be that nationalism, I would humbly argue is problematic, very problematic.
Yeah, I've seen how that kind of works in practice, in the sense that, you know, we talk about these ideas of what is kind of cultural pride and pride in the language, and then what is unacceptable Islamically. Well, being in the Bengali community, there's a large portion of aunties and uncles there who disapprove of me on the basis that I'm not Bengali. And that's and it doesn't matter whether I'm Muslim, non-Muslim, or how practicing I am. That's of no concern to them. But what is concerning to them is the fact that I'm not Bengali. And I've seen so many, even like religious families or so-called religious families, very practicing uncles who won't let their daughter marry an Indian Muslim or a Pakistani Muslim. And I've heard statements from, again, very practicing Bengalis about how Rohingyan people are naturally criminals, and that's why you can't let them into Bangladesh.
My dear brother, wallahi, I'm so sorry to have heard that you're experiencing this, or you have experienced this and you still are. But let me just tell you something, and something for the listeners, and I'm sure many of you guys would have experienced this, witnessed this or heard of this. As I mentioned earlier on the podcast, racism and nationalism and asabiya has micro and macro levels. Now, you said that you've experienced practicing, or generally just many Bengali families have kind of given the cold shoulder or rejected you because you are not fully ethnically Bengali, right? But how would you feel that even within Sylheti circles, certain villages and certain unions have certain reputations, and it is desired not to marry from within that area? And for the Pakistani brothers and sisters who are listening, especially those of you from Azad Jammu Kashmir, you know that when the Bradri system kicks in, right, which is still very much prevalent, it absolutely matters whether a Jat can marry a Rajput, or a Rajput can marry a Bands, or a Bands can marry a Jat, or whether a Pathan can marry a Malang, or whether a Mistri can marry, etc. Micro tribalism and asabiya is one thing, and it's as disgusting and toxic as the macro asabiya nationalism. So my dear brother, wallahi, I'm so sorry that you've had to experience that. But let me tell you something, there are so many different layers of this disgusting attitude which exists. It exists between some white revert, actually I'm not going to say white, I'm going to say many white revert Muslims, and how they perceive people of color or their brothers and sisters who happen to be from the Asian subcontinent. It exists between Turks and Arabs, Turks and Kurds. It exists within East African, West Africans. It exists within Khalijis and non-Khalijis, Khalijis and Maghrebis. It exists between Khalijis and Shamis. It's disgusting. And then you look into on a micro level, then you go into the tribes, the regions, the areas. And it's disgusting. And this is what I mean, that when certain sentiments, which initially may have been acceptable or understandable, then quickly morphs into and evolves into a kind of mindset and attitude which is clear-cut haram, right? When, there's one thing where you have a cultural preference, right? If you want to give your daughter or your sister away, there's a cultural preference. But when there is a zero tolerance policy towards certain Muslims from particular regions or particular races, we now know that we are truly living that era of racism and asabiya. And I would even go as far as to say that it has existed, it has always existed, and I would even go as far as to say that it will always exist. It's just that in today's day and age, it's far more apparent, And it's not even something that's hidden anymore. You know, we have a problem in the UK where many black brothers and sisters are denied marriage simply because they are black, simply because there are certain stereotypes and certain connotations pertaining to black Muslims and blacks generally, right? And the same would go for white Muslims. Many white Muslims also, you know, experience marital issues here. Prior to becoming Muslims, they may have slept around and were sexually promiscuous and so forth. Um, but then you have the intra-Asian racism and asabiya which exists, whereby, you know, a Gujarati would never give his daughter away to a Punjabi, and a Punjabi would never give his daughter or sister away to a Pathan, or Bangladesh, or a Sylheti would not give his daughter or someone away to someone for Rajshahi or Kamilla. It exists, brothers. Now, we need to draw a line, obviously, between cultural preference, which I understand, right? If you're going to have a daughter-in-law who's going to live in the house potentially with the mother, and there's going to be language barriers, etc., and there's a genuine preference, but then the preference is very much different to a zero-tolerance policy. So just to kind of not, forgive me for digressing, if we were to take it back to the issue of nationalism and the sentiments which have cemented that psyche within 1.5 billion Muslims today. And remember, we have now a new problem of asabiya within Western Muslims, who now put their country of birth before their religious identity. I am a proud British first. I'm a proud Aussie first. I'm a proud Yankee first. I'm a proud Canadian. You know, there's a huge reformist agenda which is intrinsically linked to the war on terror and the countering violent extremism industry, which is now kind of deform normative aspects of Islam, which is essentially making us less ummatic and more Eurocentric. So this whole discussion is happening in the UK at the moment about fundamental British values. That why are third, fourth generation Muslims, why are these guys not loyal? Why are they not loyal to this country? There were even discussions literally just 8 weeks ago that certain groups, not even like everyone, certain groups who work in the public sector should take an oath of allegiance to the United Kingdom and the royal family. Yani there are masajid in the UK here who have taken an oath on the that they will remain loyal to the British Armed Forces. Not many, alhamdulillah, but there are a number of them, a few in Leicester and a few other parts of this country. And this is all of this is part of, it falls into that massive umbrella of asabiya and the different forms of it. Whether it is tribal, whether it is about ethnicity, whether it's about nationality, whether it's about, you know, whatever aspect of tribalism which you decide to take excessive pride and arrogance in. So you're dealing with the nationalism of the Muslim majority world, whereby we're now essentially 53 or 57 plus countries. Then you're dealing with this new kind of nationalism now amongst Muslim diasporas in the Western world, and that is this kind of immense pressure to put your country of birth first before everything. So we are dealing with different levels of asabiya, and I truly believe that it is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, obstacle to Islamic revival and Muslim unity in today's world. Wallahi, I genuinely believe this. I genuinely believe that once we start seeing the issues of Sham as a Bengali, that is my problem, or the problem of Kashmir as an Arab is my problem, and we start seeing the issues of Central African Republic and Nigeria and Somalia as Arabs as our problem. And I'm not just talking about lip service. I'm not just talking about, you know, glossy fundraisers. I'm literally talking about getting up off on my backsides and doing something about it with your mouth, with your hands, with your wealth. And I believe this. I believe that nationalism, in its many, you know, demonic and disgusting forms, is the biggest obstacle to Muslim unity and Islamic revival from a manifestation perspective, right? But then I also need to add this as well. I think there's a huge disconnect between governments, regimes, the echelons of power, and the general awam and the ummah. We've seen how the Muslim ummah nobly responds when there's issues happening around the world. We saw Muslims in Turkey taken to the streets over what's happening in Burma. We've seen Muslims in the streets of Europe take to the streets when things were kicking off in Central African Republic, when Christian militias were literally burning Muslims alive in Central African Republic. We always see how Muslims respond when things kick off in Gaza. So the Ummah, I believe there is khair in the Ummah. And there's a number of researches and polls that have taken place. The most prominent one via Maryland University, and another one by Pew Research 2 years ago, where they interviewed a large specimen of people in 7 or 8 Muslim majority countries, and they asked them, number one, would you like to be united with other Muslim majority countries based on the bond of faith? Many of them said yes. Many of them said that, would you want to be ruled by Sharia law or see more religion in public life? Many of them said yes. Now, of course, there's a whole discussion about how robust a piece of research is, etc., and all that kind of stuff. I think the sentiments within the Ummah is certainly there, that they do see one another as brothers, and we see it in Hajj, we see it in Ramadan, we see it when we pray. But it's sad that we don't see it in other aspects of our life when we look at the issues and the events taking place in other parts of the Muslim world. But at the same time, you also see the nationalism. You see it both. I see it. We'll see it. I don't know if you guys have ever seen, or met or know religious brothers and sisters who are very practicing, who have a very ummah-centric attitude in terms of their activism or their da'wah. But at the same time, they take great pride in where they're from, and that comes out when it comes to football or cricket, etc. Or how they kind of subconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally, talk about Muslims from neighboring countries. And then you just need to say, wow, how and you know what, wallahi, I would say that many years ago I was like this. I would pray, I would consider myself to be quote unquote a practicing brother, but then I would also hold racial stereotypes towards brothers from Pakistan, from India, from Somalia, and other parts of the Muslim world, right? And that kind of clash in the Muslim psyche is something that has to be addressed, right? I mean, I'm about to say something very controversial here. I believe that there is an element, even if it's a very tiny form, of racial stereotyping within us all. I believe that. Even if we don't say it with our mouths or show it with our limbs, I believe elements of it exist within our mindset. However, I think that we need to overcome that, and I believe that it's an oxymoron, and it just doesn't make sense to have an ummah-centric attitude and worldview when it comes to dawah and activism. But in your locality and in your everyday life, you hold certain stereotypes and you hold certain kind of discriminatory views and attitudes towards brothers and sisters from other parts of the Muslim world or other parts of their ethnic origin.
Yeah.
So yeah, man. I mean, nationalism and asabiyyah is something we can talk about till the cows come home. It is a disease and it's disgusting, and we can easily fall into it. Wallahi, we can all easily fall into it, and all it takes is a cricket match or a football match or a local five-a-side footy game down in the park, right? Where you've got 10, 12, 15 brothers and they're like, hey guys, let's just do Pakistanis with Bengalis, man. Let's just do Indians with Pakistanis. It can, no, I've seen it happen, brothers. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen with up in North London, right? I've seen it happen between Turks and Kurds, where a friendly footy match has turned into a massive punch-up, right? And then all the kind of vitriolic, attitudes and the nastiness comes out. And that's why we can't easily fall into it. So I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala safeguards us from this disease and safeguards us from it from all its manifestations. And I pray that Allah uplifts this massive obstacle that we have on a real life level in terms of borders and from a psychological perspective in our minds.
I mean, I can really relate to you mentioned nationalism in sport, because even in Sydney, there's some like high level football that's played, or soccer, where there's like Marconi and Bonnarigg and stuff. There's like one club is all Croatians, one club is all Serbs, and when they play each other, there's literally riots after the game in the crowd, and to the point where they have police always there escorting the team. It's insane, like the racism that's in sport as well. But I wanted to kind of shift the gears a bit because in regards to, we're on the topic of, terror war, 1971 and stuff. But I wanted to focus on current news because right now there was, news of Khashoggi's murder. And I think that's an interesting discussion to have because we aren't sure of, what Saudi Arabia did. Oh, well, we can assume for the most part, but at the same time, they haven't really made any statements or said anything particularly. They've been kind of avoiding it, but at the same time alluding to, or they just cooperating with, the investigations and stuff. But what's your kind of take on that situation? Because it's a bit of chaos how everything has happened, because when you're watching it, you're thinking, I think there was like 3 statements. So the first one was the fact that they denied it, Saudi Arabia, outright. Second time they said, he died, but it was in a fist fight. Well, the third one was that it was like a rogue team that kind of allowed it to happen. And it's a bit of inconsistency there because you feel that if, let's just hypothetically say Saudi Arabia, this was a very planned and deliberate attack on Khashoggi, that they would have planned it better. That, there was that video of someone that left the consulate kind of dressed as Khashoggi, but it seems like it's gone to complete, it shows how amateur Saudis have been in regards to the whole situation. But what's your take on it?
Erdogan called them childish this morning. He said that their excuses were childish.
Well, Erdogan, we'll get to Erdogan and Turkey's role and the way they've played this shortly, hopefully. But for the listeners, I'm sure that most of you have been following the Jamal Khashoggi case. Now, Jamal Khashoggi is
could you give us a brief?
Pardon?
Because I'm not clued in on current Arab.
Okay, so Jamal Khashoggi, may Allah have mercy on him and forgive him for his shortcomings and make it easy for him in the grave. He's a prominent Saudi journalist. He's been reporting for the Washington Post, Al Arabiya, and he's a contributor and a columnist for other mainstream Western outlets. He covered the Afghan-Soviet war. He spoke to a number of mujahideen during the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. He even interviewed a number of resistance movements during some iconic wars. And he has perhaps one of the most well-known Saudi journalists in the world. Certainly, at least within Western circles, and he has, he has generally been pro-government for most of his life. He has been pro-government. He has been pro-Saudi. Yeah,
He was Afghani, right?
Yeah, he's had senior advisory roles with successive Saudi rulers. He's been a PR advisor to a number of Saudi princes and for the Ministry of Defense. And he's, so this is not someone who's seen as, anti-regime, or he's not someone who's always been critical of the Saudi government. However, he was critical of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and obviously that was a problem. And there's even some insinuations that he was the kind of thinking that power should be distributed in the monarchies, namely Saudi Arabia, in a more democratic fashion. And as soon as he made those kind of insinuations in his writings, as in certain interviews, he was quite quickly labeled as Ikhwani, or the Brotherhood type, which isn't entirely true, because being pro-democratic doesn't immediately mean that you're Ikhwani or from the Brotherhood thinking, and no, in the same way that when people say Islamist movements, that doesn't essentially mean Brotherhood type movements. So Jamal Khashoggi, a prominent Saudi journalist who was in Turkey, went into the consulate for some paperwork over a divorce. He then disappeared. So the story was broken to the Middle East Eye, a news outlet which I'm a columnist for. They broke the story that Jamal Khashoggi, prominent Saudi journalist, has disappeared. He's gone missing, right? And this came from his wife, who said that he went to the consulate to pick up some paperwork and didn't come out. Saudi, there was outright denial for at least a week. We don't know nothing about Khashoggi. He came in that day, he left that day, and of course they even tried presenting certain CCTV images of a guy who looked like Khashoggi dressed in his clothes, which we then found out more recently that wasn't him. And then there was an admission that yes, you know what, he did die, but he died in a fight. And then, of course, there was kind of consistent but very small drips of information being leaked by the Turkish government. First, that a squad of 15 henchmen arrived in a private jet. At least two of them were known to be very close to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And of course, then Saudi, once they realized that they had been pushed to a corner and the Turkish government had got them just where they wanted, then they kind of said, yes, this was a rogue murder. And now all kinds of things are coming out. All kinds of things are coming out. There, people are saying that Khashoggi was killed because he was affiliated to the Brotherhood. Khashoggi was killed because he was speaking ill of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Washington Post. Washington Post being a huge American and international renowned media outlet. And then there was even discussion that there were ideas and plans of Khashoggi launching an Al Jazeera type news network, and one which would be essentially critical of the Saudi government if Mohammed bin Salman, when he officially assumed power. So there's a number of reasons as to why he was killed. But I think there is no shadow of it, there's no doubt that he was murdered. And the fact that, his remains have now been found in the consulate. And the selective outrage, especially from Western liberals, has been laughable, disgraceful. We've had tens of thousands of Muslims being killed in Yemen by Saudi Arabia, and you barely hear a peep. Then when it comes to the heinous murder of Khashoggi, and the entire Western world, including Turkey, is up in arms, right? And that kind of should show to you, brothers and sisters, that the double standards, which everyone kind of knows exists, right? And the kind of selective outrage which exists within the Western governments of regimes who they arm, who they fund, who they prop up, who they give weapons to, that when they go and destabilize and commit massacres and imprison soldiers and ulama and activists, that is all brushed under the carpet. But when a prominent journalist who is known within their radar because he wrote for some of their major newspapers, right? When he passes away or when he's killed in such a fashion, it now becomes breaking news, the main news bulletin for the last 2 weeks. So my thoughts on just to recap is that the Saudi handling of this case has been ridiculous. It's been a joke. It's like literally you couldn't make this up. Like, I'm sure those of you who have nephews and nieces and young kids, if you told them to write a kid's story, that they could possibly even cover it up better than this. This is the way they've covered it up is just it's like kindergarten stuff, right? The inconsistency in their defenses and their explanations has been ridiculous. The defensive nature of the Saudi foreign minister, of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who randomly went onto the Saudi media the other day, I forgot which channel it was, and starts praising Qatar's economy. They recently hosted Prime Minister Imran Khan, and I think they gave him $3 billion or $10 billion for some economic issues or deficit which Pakistan is facing. Now, Saudi's handling of this issue has been crazy, and that's not to say that they should have handled it better, because that's just saying that they should be better at hiding their crimes. But those who know and those who follow the current affairs of the Muslim majority world, especially Saudi Arabia, know that extrajudicial killing, kidnapping, murder, imprisonment, and of course what's happening in Yemen, these are crimes which have resulted in the deaths of thousands and thousands of Muslims. Yet we hear very little about it. Yet the murder of Khashoggi has awoken the whole world. And somehow, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is the kind of Lucifer reincarnate, and he's like the biggest boogeyman. Well, hold up here. the Saudi regime has been committing these sort of crimes for decades, arguably since the inception of their state. They've been bombing Yemen for the last 3-4 years. So all I'm asking for here is just a bit of consistency in outrage. But I won't hold my breath, because we highlight these things, and then the Western press and Western policymakers and thinkers and the commentariats, they will just stick to their narratives. And that this was a progressive, pro-democratic journalist who was brutally and horrifically murdered in a foreign country, in the consulate, which are all valid points. But, it's just a reflection of how crazy the Saudi government is. And I wouldn't just restrict this to Saudi, by the way. The Libyan government under Gaddafi, they assassinated anti-regime protesters in the UK. We know that Arab regimes, they assassinate people just like Mossad does a lot with the Palestinian resistance leaders. Arab regimes also, assassinate and kill and imprison people who speak out against them, even remotely. And Khashoggi, it can be argued, was a regime man. For the most part of his life, he was a regime man. But obviously, he wasn't entirely supportive of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Wrote a few pieces criticizing him and his policies, and obviously, unfortunately, that got him into the unfortunate situation that he found himself in. And that's the story, brothers and sisters. And as for Turkey, and we kind of tend to just forget Turkey's role in all of this. Now, yes, this murder took place on Turkish soil, and of course, the rules pertaining to embassies and consulates differ. But Turkey has milked this so much. You have to give Erdogan a round of applause. The way he's played this, he's got Saudi exactly where he wants them. Because you have to understand there has been conflicting antagonisms between Turkey and Saudi Arabia for the last 3-4 years. Especially, it peaked when the boycott of Qatar took place, and of course Turkey supported Qatar, and of course there's the whole kind of Muslim Brotherhood element, which is that Turkey, or at least Erdogan and the AK Party, are seen as supporters and subscribers to the Brotherhood movement, or at least their way of thinking and their politics, as is Qatar. And Turkey quite unapologetically took the side of Qatar. And then, of course, there's the whole Syria dynamics with Saudi Arabia in line with US policy in Syria, backing the Kurds. But then the Kurds or the PKK and the Peshmerga are those that Turkey are fighting on their borders. So there's a lot of, issues happening between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And Turkey right now has got Saudi Arabia exactly where they want them. And there was a senior figure of the AK party that was close to Erdogan, and he informed the Turkish press that Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia offered financial aid, investments, and an end to a Saudi embargo on Qatar to drop the Khashoggi case. And Erdogan allegedly, it has been reported in the Turkish press, by the way, that Erdogan angrily rejected the offer as a political bribe. Now, that's all good and well, and that's very noble of Mr. Erdogan. But there have been questions that have come up, is that why has Turkey delayed the investigation? Why did they delay the investigation? Why did they drip feed the world through particular outlets about certain information about this entire Khashoggi case? Because the rules pertaining to what the host nation can do to an embassy doesn't apply to a consulate. So the Turkish government and the enforcement authorities could have easily kicked down the doors and started doing a search of the Saudi consulate, but they chose not to. What they did was they opted for the PR move, and it's worked wonderfully for them. They've come off looking like the heroes, the more kind of noble protagonists in this entire case. But the reality is that Turkish authorities and enforcement agencies, they very much delayed the investigation of the Khashoggi murder. They drip-fed the media selective information. They've played it's been artistic the way the Turks have played this. Yeah. And
Like a story.
yeah, and Erdogan has
It's like a
fully
whole
milked
story.
this for political mileage, because he's got Saudi exactly where he wants them now. You know. So yeah, that's the case of Khashoggi. No one really knows exactly why he was killed. You know whether it was that he was very critical of current MBS. I mean,
Can't you say with Turkey, because since we're talking about Turkey, that I didn't know. I thought there was a rule in place where they can't just kick down doors of consulates and stuff and barge in. But as you just mentioned, they can. But
embassies. The rules are different. Rules are different to consulates.
okay. So they could have done that, but they've opted not to. But even on the point of a murder of a journalist, we know that Turkey have been doing unjust jailing of journalists in Turkey as well. So wouldn't you say it's a bit of hypocrisy where they're showing the moral high ground when it comes to talking about what Saudi have done is not good, and they're kind of milking it where they kind of do it to their own journalists as well, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, after the failed attempted coup of 2016, there has been widespread arrests of journalists, academics, teachers, Islamic activists, police officers, all under this broad umbrella of all being Gulenists, and many of them still remain in prison, right? As these kind of part of the coup plotters. But what Turkey, or at least Erdogan or AK Party supporters would argue, is that we've not killed any journalists in consulates in foreign countries, not in the way that it was done by the Saudis. So yeah, whilst we do arrest and imprison and possibly even torture some of our journalists and our public sector workers, there's a valid reason for it, because there was a coup attempt. So yes, there is clearly a double standard here from the Turkish perspective, and perhaps some of them should get off their moral high ground and think about the hundreds of teachers and journalists that are rotting away in their dungeons and the prisons since 2016. But then they would obviously argue that we've not killed anyone abroad. We've not killed anyone in our consulates. We have not sent a private jet full of henchmen to essentially, mutilate and chop someone up into pieces like something out of The Sopranos. We've not done that, you know. But yeah, I think Turkey has fully milked this, and I think this is very reflective of I wouldn't use the word genius, but I'd say the kind of politicking of Erdogan and the AK Party and their government, in the way that they are very tactful in how they maneuver around Middle Eastern politics and the region and the regional neighbors and the different players. The way, if you look at Turkey's relationship with Russia and Iran during the beginning of the Syrian war, and now they are practically best friends, right? They're like, there's a whole discussion now about this new trio alliance now forming between Iran, Russia, and Turkey, and that the whole Turkish economy collapsing, the lira, which collapsed nearly by 40%, not too long ago. I believe it was about 2 months ago. And we were all told that is to do with them not releasing this this American pasta, which Trump wanted. No, this was all to do with the geopolitics of the region. America was not happy that Turkey was buying weapons from Russia, in particular these particular missiles. I forgot their name. And then, of course, there was this whole kind of alliance that has been building for the last 2 years between Turkey, Iran, and Russia. So Turkey, and when I say Turkey here, brothers and sisters and listeners, I'm referring to the Erdogan government. I'm not talking about every single Turk. I hope, obviously, that I shouldn't have had to
Pardon
highlight.
my ignorance, though, but because even with we can hone in about Syria at the moment. You said Turkey. Obviously, they have some economic ties with Russia and even Iran to an extent. But you see,
And
with
Israel.
the Syrian situation, how they're obviously opposed against the al-Assad kind of government, and Russia are siding with Assad. So how does that dynamics play out? So what's like Turkey's objective at the end of the day?
I think Turkey's number one objective in Syria is to protect the border where the Kurdish Peshmerga and the PKK are located in. And I think that's their priority, to protect that border with Syria, where the Kurdish fighters are currently occupying. I think that's their priority. They don't want this buffer that's created, whereby they've got a very hostile and armed, US armed Kurdish fighters on their border. I think that's their priority. But at face value, on paper, Turkey has, at least in the last 2 to 3 years, has called for a resolution, has called for Russia to back off or ease off on the bombing, have called for an armistice and a cool-off period whereby certain rebel factions are allowed to exit certain areas. But the truth be told, brothers and sisters and listeners, Eastern Halep, Eastern Aleppo last December was lost to the regime. The border of Eastern Halep was barely a couple of miles from Turkish borders. I spoke to a number of activists, namely our brother Bilal Abdul Karim, the American journalist who's currently out there, and he said that you could see Turkish soldiers. As we were leaving Eastern Halep, we could see Turkish soldiers in the border. And the loss of Eastern Halep happened in front of their eyes. And this is the same Turkey which backed and armed a number of rebel factions, namely the Free Syrian Army. This is the same Turkey which allowed a number of fighters from the West to jump over their borders to fight the Assad regime. And this is the same Turkey now that is doing nothing over Idlib in terms of a military perspective. They did nothing over Eastern Halep. There were even discussions that, certain trade-offs were happening, whereby the Kurds would be fought or moved away from the borders of Turkey if the regime were given safe passage into certain rebel-held areas. Now, Idlib is the last rebel stronghold that remains in Syria. There are other pocket towns and villages and areas around Syria, but generally speaking, it was Halep, Aleppo, and Idlib. Halep is entirely under the Assad regime. The only remaining stronghold is in Idlib. And Idlib currently is under siege. It is under daily bombardment from Russian planes and planes belonging to the Assad regime. And just recently, I'm not saying just recently, I'm talking about last month, I believe, there was a meeting between Turkey, Iran, and Russia. I believe it was in Kazakhstan, I forgot the city. And Erdogan was hailed as a champion for, preventing a massacre in Idlib. So the Russians did back off. And when I say they backed off, I'm literally saying that they decreased the consistency of their bombing. The Russians are still bombing Idlib. The Assad regime is still bombing Idlib and still starving Idlib. But what would have been another Eastern Halep was prevented from that conference which took place in Kazakhstan. If you look at it from a pragmatic point of view, and if you speak to Erdogan's supporters, and there are many, many of them around the Muslim world, and I'm sure you have many of them in Australia, like we do in the UK, they will say that, well, hold on, you're being a bit romanticist and a bit idealistic. It's easier saying all this stuff from the comforts of your chair, but when you're actually a leader of a state and you're dealing with other states and people's lives, it's not easy just to march in to Syria and play the hero. Well, Turkey has already intervened in Syria. Turkey has intervened in Syria a number of times. Turkey intervened in Iraq. Saudi has intervened in Bahrain. A number of Muslim majority countries have intervened militarily in other Muslim majority countries. So I think, again, we need to be consistent when we talk about military intervention by Muslim majority countries. On the one hand, we say, their hands are tied, they cannot do nothing, they do very little, and can you imagine what would happen to Turkey or Erdogan if they did this? But at the same time, they quite easily send soldiers over the border into Syria to fight the Kurds. So the point I'm trying to make here is that if you look at it from a pragmatic point of view, a number of Erdogan supporters and Turkish supporters will say, well, hold on, Erdogan, through diplomacy with Iran and Russia, prevented another Eastern Halep. He prevented another massacre. And I guess if that's the kind of benchmark that you're or the kind of standards that you're happy with, that okay, a massacre's going to happen sooner or later, but Erdogan has just bought the Syrians of Idlib some time, right? If you want to look at it from that point of view, then yeah, I guess Erdogan was the hero of Idlib. But maybe you should speak to the Muslims of Idlib. Maybe you should speak to our brother Tokir, a British activist who's been there for many years from the beginning of the conflict in Idlib. Maybe brothers should take time to speak to Bilal Abdul Karim. Maybe brothers and sisters who have this kind of very positive view of Turkey's role in the Syrian conflict, maybe you should speak to Muslims, activists, journalists, aid workers who are in Idlib. And they'll tell you whether the bombing has stopped. And they'll tell you if whether Turkish diplomacy has really saved lives or not. Right? And then we also know what has come to surface, that Turkish intelligence services have been causing friction and disunity between different rebel factions, namely Ahrar al-Sham and other rebel factions and the Free Syrian Army. So you can take that very kind of positive, pragmatic, and I would even say ignorant view. It is, because it's ignorant. You can take that very kind of cheerleading view and say, yeah, Erdogan did fantastic work. You know, he prevented another massacre in Idlib. And what do you expect him to do? Go in there with all guns blazing? Yeah, okay, fine. If that's the kind of standards you're okay with, then these brothers and sisters and activists and supporters will probably be the same people who probably cheered Erdogan when he criticized Israel in the Turkish parliament, sent the Israeli ambassador home for 7 days and then continued trade deals pretty much immediately. But then the criticism of the other side is that you guys are idealists, you guys are romanticists, you guys have no idea of the reality and what it actually means from a state to state, that if one country was to intervene excessively, what kind of threat both domestically and internationally that would have on a particular nation. But we need to strike a balance here. Okay, fine. If Turkey going in all guns blazing to rescue the Syrians in Idlib is out of question, surely he can do more than not just have diplomacy with Iran and Russia. Because it's not just diplomacy. Because at the back of this diplomacy, Erdogan and Turkey are buying weapons from Russia. And trade deals are increasing with Iran. Right? So it's not just about Idlib and Syria. Trade deals and relations with Russia and Iran, the butchers of our brothers and sisters in Syria for the last 5 years, those relationships are becoming increasingly cozy for Mr. Erdogan and the AK Party government. So I think a level of balance is required, a sense of consistency is required. That yes, Turkey has taken millions of Syrian refugees, but really, that's like saying, the Hasina regime, we must praise her because she allowed X number of Rohingya refugees to come in. Yani, is this the benchmark? Is this the standard that Muslims have these days from our rulers? That they are, So
I was certainly when I even before I accepted Islam, I was very kind of sympathetic towards Erdogan. I was quite impressed by what he had done for Muslims in Turkey in terms of because no kind of anyone with a kind of Islamic slant or bringing Islam into the political arena in Turkey had any kind of success. And people think that the AK party was like the sort of first kind of Islamic movement in Turkey that gained any traction. Well, it wasn't. You had Milli Görüş back in the day, which was with Necmettin Erbakan, which was like a very sort of Islamist movement. And I feel like a lot of people had high hopes for what Turkey could bring to the Muslim world and to Sunni Muslims, who by and large had been on the back foot since the invasion of Iraq and probably even well before that. Probably you could even argue for the last century. But what it kind of gets to is I definitely agree with you. I would have certainly been one to take that kind of pragmatic approach and be like, oh, well, brother, what can Erdogan do? But Turkey have definitely shown that they're more than happy to get involved when it suits their interests. But I kind of wanted to ask you just overall, I mean, now we see the situation in Syria, the war perhaps drawing to a close, what does it mean for us, for Muslims and Sunni Muslims particularly, the resolution in Syria as it stands?
I think the conflict in Syria has been, and this is a very strong descriptive word for that war. I think it's been a kind of furqan. If you look at the Arab Spring and the uprisings and the revolutions which took place in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Syria, people, and Libya, of course, many Muslims will say to you that Syria was the epitome of the disaster of the Arab Spring. But I would argue, and I genuinely feel this, that Syria was the most blessed uprising and revolution from the Arab Spring. Why? Because those Muslims who took to the streets in Homs in 2011, chanting Ashab Yurid Isqat al-Nizam, when they went there with no weapons, fearing none other but Allah, that they remained true to their words even till today. And the hundreds and thousands of those who have been martyred, their families, we should go and ask them whether they are ready to accept a resolution with the murderers of their loved ones. We should ask them whether they regretted taking to the streets in 2011, right? And very quickly, what made Syria unique to the other countries who were involved in what was known as the Arab Spring is that there was a very strong and consistent Islamic sentiment coming from the opposition. The reason why I say this before I answer your question, brother, is that this is what makes Syria unique. And of course, Syria falls under Sham, and there are many hadith and verses of the Quran which refers to Sham, and there are many hadith which refer to the blessings of Sham and Damascus. So like Philistine, Syria was very close to the Muslim Ummah, but very quickly the war became very sectarian. Very quickly, different regional players and their Western puppets, their masters, they started intervening through weapons, through arms, through funding, and very quickly Syria became a playground for different regional players and the superpowers which essentially controlled those proxy neighboring states. Now, in terms of where I see the Syrian war going, there's a difference between where I see it going and where I want it to go. I want, like many Muslims I'm sure, would want to see a radical turnaround in the land that has been lost to the regime, for that to be won over, for Assad to be removed, and for a government to be placed which is reflective of all Syrians, especially the 80% plus Sunni Muslims, and for a government which is truly independent and one which will factor in and consider Islam when it comes to governance. That's where I'd like Syria to see
I think we all
happen. But where I see it going is that sadly Idlib will be sold sooner or later, just like Eastern Halep was sold. And it will be sold slowly and painfully, and a resolution will probably take place, and we will probably see the continuation, sadly, of Assad. Obviously, Syria will not be the same again, and I don't think that Assad will have the country under his iron fist. What we can see and may potentially see, and what we pray that we don't see, is the balkanization of Syria, whereby warlords and particular regions are essentially run by warlords and leaders based on ethnic and sectarian lines. This is the worst case scenario, brothers and sisters. This is what we do not want Syria to be. It's already in rubble. But if it becomes a land which is essentially carved up based on ethnic and sectarian lines, which one would argue it has already become, then this is the worst possible situation that one could foresee. And it's not that far away with what's happening in Syria. But we should all pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives victory to the Muslimin in Syria against the oppressors, and that Allah grants those who are sincere upon His cause victory against Assad regime and those who plot against the believers. Ameen. But the resolution is looking bleak. And in terms of the Ummah, especially Sunni Muslims, and I say Sunni Muslims because the war in Syria has been very divisive along sectarian lines, we should think and reflect that wallahi the Syrian rebels were knocking on the gates of Damascus at the end of 2012, January 2013. In January 2013, the rebels had got as far into Damascus that literally the world was thinking it's just a matter of days that Bashar was going to fall. And then things very quickly changed with the dawn of ISIS, with Russia then getting involved, with Turkey changing its policy when it initially began as supporting the opposition generally, to then specifying that it's support for the Free Syrian Army and then Ahrar al-Sham, and then putting in caveats. And this is not just Turkey, by the way, this is Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, those countries who, through the nod of the US, armed certain rebel groups and then withdrew those arms, funded certain groups and then withdrew those funds, held back their own soldiers. They changed their policies, and that's why we find Syria in the situation that we did. That we were literally, and I say we because the victory for the Muslims of Syria would have been a victory for the Ummah. In the same way that when we saw tyrants and dictators topple during the Arab Spring, from Ben Ali to Mubarak to Gaddafi, these were victories for the Ummah. We literally thought that this is it, this is a new dawn. But obviously things changed very quickly, with different players playing on the ground and manipulating things. Things turned out. But Syria was that one country from the Arab Spring which people thought they still had hope in. And literally we were at the brink of victory in January 2013, knocking on the doors of Damascus. And then by 2014, things had changed, with ISIS in the game, taking over lands that had already been liberated, with Turkey radically shifting its policy, with the kind of anti-ISIS alliance, the bombing of Raqqa, 63 plus countries prioritizing taking out ISIS, totally ignoring that sarin gas and other chemical weapons had been used against the Muslims of Ghouta and other places. The fact that 250,000 Muslims, Syrians, the vast majority civilians, had been killed, yet there was not a single piece of action or intervention from the Muslim majority country or the Western governments. But to fight ISIS, there was a 63 country alliance. So this is where we find ourselves in Syria, the unfortunate situation. But this is the qadr of Allah. Brothers and sisters, those who have died in this cause, do not think of them as being slain or their life has been given in vain. No. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they are accepted as martyrs. The question should be on us. What have we done with our mouths, with our hands, with the platform and the resources that we've had to our access, to our governments? Have we held them to account? What have they done? We know that Muslim majority countries, especially the Arab countries, they have intervened in neighboring conflicts when it suits their interest. They've done it, they've all done it, and they continue to do it. But when it really matters, they sold Syria. They sold Syria. They armed certain rebel groups, they funded certain rebel groups, they allowed fighters to join the ranks through their borders, yet when it mattered, they withdrew the arms, they withdrew the funding, they shut the borders, and they then start changing their policies and causing fitna within the different rebel groups within Syria. And Syria right now has so many players within the conflict. We have the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, we have the Russians, we have the Kurds, we have Al-Mossad, the Israeli intelligence services, we have Turkish troops and rebel factions which are loyal and have their allegiance with with Turkey. We have the Turkish intelligence services, we have the Jordanian intelligence services, we have the Saudi intelligence services, and that's not even talking about the CIA and the MI5 and those special forces who are all mixed up into this conflict. In a conflict which has now become so messy, and lines which have become so blurred, that it's very difficult to tell who sides with who. But what we do know is that Idlib is the last remaining stronghold. We pray that it remains strong and firm against the plots and the plans of the oppressors. We pray that things change radically for the Muslims of Syria, but it's looking bleak and it's looking bad. And I fear that there will be a Balkanization of Syria, whereby entire regions and cities and countrysides will be literally carved up based on ethnic and sectarian lines. Druze, Alawi, Shia, Christian, Kurd, Sunnis, I fear that that's what's going to happen. But we pray that it doesn't happen, inshallah.
Inshallah. I want to ask a random question, but you get a lot of Shias supporting Assad, but then when Shias, talk about like Karbala and justice and stuff, isn't a bit of hypocrisy? What's your views on that? Because I get that because we have in Sydney quite a few Shias that are very, most of them are pretty much pro-Assad. I know it's very sectarian and stuff, but what's your views on that?
My views are very clear. I've said it on TV interviews, I've written it in articles. Any Muslim, Shia or Sunni, who claims to be from the party of Imam Hussein radiallahu anhu, but then finds themselves defending, remaining silent, and justifying the actions of tyrants such as Bashar, or Putin, or Hasina, or Al-Saud, or any of these despotic rulers, but then claim to be on the party of Imam Hussein, they are hypocrites. And hypocrites in the English definition, not the Sharia. Yeah? You are hypocrites. And I say this to their faces quite plainly. I've said it to a number of Shia activists in the UK. But at the same time, I've also said it to a number of Sunni brothers and sisters who claim to be upon the side of Imam Hussein, who claim to be upon the Sunnah of Musa alayhi salam, who claim to be upon the path of justice and speaking a word of truth to a tyrant ruler, yet find themselves making so many excuses, so much husnad dhan, so much contextualization and justification over the actions of rulers and despotic regimes. And that applies to many ulama at the same time as well. So I say to those Shia Muslims who claim to be from the party of Imam Hussein, who to be upon the manhaj of Imam Hussein, that if you find yourself defending or even remaining silent over the actions of Bashar or any despotic ruler who has the blood of innocent Muslims on their hands, you are not from the camp of Imam Hussein. You are a hypocrite.
I guess the most nuanced argument that I've heard from Assad supporters, and I wouldn't even call them supporters, but one point that has been raised to me a lot. Obviously, I've been very critical of Assad, and I've called for his removal. But the argument against that has been positioned to me is the fact that it's like, well, who's the alternative? At the moment, like, think about what the state of Syria is, and who has power in the region and within the country as well. And you virtually have different proxy groups in the country acting upon the interests of greater powers, as we've mentioned.
This is a straw man. Sorry, Akhi, to intervene. Intervene. The reason why I had to interrupt you there, because I've heard this so many times. It's a straw man. Oh, who's better, Bashar or ISIS? Who's better, Bashar or these head choppers? These crazy sectarian Salafi nut jobs? Yeah, who's better? That's one argument. The other argument is, brother, I rather side with Iran and Bashar than the Zionists. The Zionists back takfiris and this and that. I've heard it all, right? And these axes of resistance cheerleaders, and those who are listening and those who know Five Pillars well know that my editor and my business partner, Roshan Muhammad Saleh, is kind of from that line of thinking as well, right? Whilst he does not say that he's a supporter of Bashar al-Assad, he says that he's better than what the alternative is. And I will say this is bakwas. Those who know Hindi, Bengali, Urdu know bakwas is just utter nonsense, right? We cannot talk about hypotheticals. We cannot talk about what is the alternative. Who the hell said that the alternative to Bashar was ISIS? No one said that. That's a false dichotomy. That's something that which they've spun and done this to justify their defense and their justification for tyranny. What is an alternative to Bashar is a government which is reflective of the masses, not a ultra sectarian, godless government. Yeah, the Alawis and his loyal Shabiha, yeah, who are not reflective of the Syrian masses, who are brutal, despotic, tyrannical, who are draconian in every way of censoring political freedoms and press freedoms and religious freedoms. Right? Even though this notion of freedom is, this kind of political notion of freedom is not necessarily one that's from our tradition, but still, the way that they've censored and cracked down on a number of non-violent Sunni ulama and political movements and Islamic movements and madrasas and what is better than Bashar is any government that is reflective of the Muslims of Syria, right? And this nonsense that somehow supporting the rebel factions is essentially supporting Turkey, Saudi, Qatar, who are essentially NATO, who are essentially America, Britain, and France, who are essentially Zionists. I've heard this so much. I've heard this for the last 5 years. Brothers and sisters who peddle this nonsense, stop. Just stop it. Yeah? The point here is because you fail to understand the assistance that a Muslim brother or Muslim masses are able to give to their brothers and sisters from another land in terms of funding, in terms of weapons, in terms of their own sons. Because you fail to understand this, you have essentially created within your mind, which is in full alignment with the Iranian and the Russian and the Assad propaganda, is that if you support the opposition in Syria, you are essentially a supporter of Israel and America, right? Now, one could argue, well, that's not entirely untrue, because if Turkey, Qatar, and namely Saudi Arabia are funding certain groups who are fighting the Assad regime, and they are essentially doing this in the knowledge of the American and the British, then of course, yeah, you're basically supporting the side that the Americans are on. La. What we do know, and what there seems to be an ijma, a consensus between the superpowers, Britain, America, and Russia, is that Bashar is much more favorable than any kind of Sunni Islamist government coming in, especially one which is not controlled by us and subservient to us. If there's one thing that all the superpowers agree upon and their regional proxies, is that Bashar is better than a Sunni Islamist government which is independent and which will not be subservient to our needs and our interests. And that's the crux of it. You cannot be.
No, I was going to say, I'm
sorry.
completely aware of that as it is, but I'm quite concerned about the fact that the FSA itself is made up of a number of groups. So in kind of the kind of thinking that's been brought to me is the fact that if the FSA had won, it's very likely there would have been another civil war between the victors, given how diverse the rebel groups are in Syria. I mean, you do have those American proxies who are basically in favor of liberal democracy. You have Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Is that what that? Yeah, the Al-Qaeda proxies.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
yeah, they're those connected to the kind of Salafi jihad.
Well, look. The Free Syrian Army was the biggest opposition at the beginning of the conflict, right? And it was mainly made up of Sunni soldiers who had defected from the Syrian army, who had then created who had then created what was known as the Free Syrian Army. And within the Free Syrian Army, a number of factions and groups fall under this huge umbrella. And within the Free Syrian Army, and you can even Google early interviews from key figures from the Free Syrian Army, they said that, look, man, we have Islamic groups, we have different groups fighting under our umbrella. But what happened very quickly by 2012, mid to late 2012, that quote unquote the Islamic rebel factions or the Islamist rebels had become the predominant and the most effective factions in the opposition. And what the Free Syrian Army was during the beginning of the conflict is not what they are right now. The Free Syrian Army is nowhere as big and numerous as they were in the beginning of the conflict. They are much smaller now, and they've been far more outspoken with regards to the kind of Syria that they foresee. And the Syria that they foresee is one which is pluralistic, which is democratic, and one which will not be an Islamic state. Key Free Syrian Army generals and leaders in the last 18 months have made this abundantly clear. But the Free Syrian Army, to begin with, and for the best part of 2-3 years of the Syrian conflict, they had different factions. They had different factions, and it was a huge umbrella group with different rebel factions, many of them Islamic. I don't like using the term Islamist because that in of itself has certain connotations, so I try not to use that term. But it had a number of Islamic rebel factions fighting under its umbrella. But it is now entirely aligned with Turkish policy in the region, especially Syria, and is heavily opposed to a number of Islamist rebel factions now, not just those who are affiliated with Al-Qaeda or were known to be affiliated to Al-Qaeda now.
It's definitely true that any kind of Islamic government would be against the interests of the West and obviously America, Russia, and obviously if it's particularly because Syria has a Sunni majority, perhaps even Iran and Hezbollah and their interests in the region. So I certainly think that there has been that kind of gradual propaganda of, well, would you rather, like, it's either Assad or ISIS. They're the only two options you have, and there's no kind of discussion of a middle sort of way that balances the Sharia and traditional understandings of Islam with a kind of governance.
Look, our good brothers and ulama and activists, for those who subscribe to the Brotherhood or Ikhwani kind of thinking, will say that the Free Syrian Army and the solution that they're calling for is Islamic. Obviously, that's an entirely different discussion for another time. But this whole kind of either it's Assad or ISIS dichotomy is nonsense. We should reject that whenever we hear it.
I agree.
And we've also, do you know what the main problem in Syria has been for Western governments? And Obama has said this, and David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, he said this, and they're still saying this. We, and by we, they're talking obviously NATO, America and Britain, we have failed to secure an opposition or elements within the opposition that we can essentially control. They've said it. Because they've given weapons, they've given funds to different groups who have essentially taken the money, taken the funds, but were like, stuff you guys and your thinking for Syria. Essentially, they could not find a Sunni opposition faction significant and influential enough to fulfill their geopolitical interests. And that has been the West's quagmire in Syria. That's why they are backing the Kurdish factions. That's why they are backing some very insignificant Sunni rebel factions. Right? It's because they've been unable to, unlike Libya, where the Libyan rebels, they welcomed the no-fly zone and NATO intervention. Unlike Libya, it's the Syrian rebels who predominantly the most effective groups were the quote-unquote Islamist rebels. They were unable to make grounds with these guys. They were unable to find a faction who were totally subservient to them. Obviously, they tried via proxies. They tried it via Qatar. They've tried it via Saudi. They tried it via Turkey, right? But then Turkey kind of went rogue and kind of put its own interest ahead of everything else. And that's what we've seen in the last 2.5 years. When Turkey kind of realized that America cannot be entirely trusted, that we need to now take care of our own and look after our own borders, and we've got hostile Kurds, Kurdish Peshmerga and PKK on our borders. We need to do what needs to be done.
Yeah, and that's
And so that has been the Western quagmire in Syria, that they've just been unable to find a faction significant enough to fulfill their interests. And had they found one, then we would have seen a whole different scenario in Syria.
Absolutely. And I think it kind of links in with the general trend of, as you mentioned, the Arab Spring and the catastrophe that it became. Because most of like, well, the other example is Egypt that we have. And I wonder what you think there. Do you think that the Muslim Brotherhood, which was democratically elected at a fair election, according to most observers in Egypt after the ousting of Mubarak, but do you think that it's kind of a similar case there, wherein the actors from outside conspired to remove a Muslim government or like quote unquote Islamist government?
Yeah, I think undeniably there was an element of by America, Saudi, the UAE to remove Morsi. May Allah hasten his release and that of our brothers from the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. Ameen. There was a quite an open agenda to remove Morsi from power, even though at face value, what threat did Morsi actually pose? What kind of real threat did he actually pose? Would he have truly been independent? Would the Freedom and Justice Party, I believe they were the Freedom and Justice Party, but anyway, whoever the party that the Ikhwan's party was, which won the elections, how independent and anti-West would they have been with Morsi in power? I don't think they would have been that much. I believe that over time, with the pragmatic nature of the Ikhwani movement in Egypt, that they would have just become the status quo, like the Ennahda has in Tunisia. Yet, merely having someone like Morsi in power was unpalatable for those who perceive the Muslim Brotherhood and generally political Islamic movements and parties as a threat, as an existential threat. And obviously, we now know that Saudi bankrolled the coup. Obama gave the subtle nod for the removal of Morsi, and the brutal crackdown of our brothers and sisters from Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and the massacre of Rabal Adawiyah. May Allah accept them all as shaheed, inshallah. Now, with regards to why Morsi was removed, now you have one argument that he was trying to do too much too quick. He was trying to Islamify Egypt way too fast, way too quick. And I would humbly disagree. I would go as far as to say that he didn't do enough too quick. He didn't take the radical measures that was required to kind of essentially make him the overarching ruler who held actual authority and not just civil authority. And even then, that
Those
was
frameworks from the military were still in place. The frameworks from the military and the old regime were still very much intact, and
look, what we had in the Arab Spring, especially in Egypt as well, yeah, but of course in Libya and in Tunisia, what we had, what was the word? Subhanallah, we had a cosmetic change, brothers. We had a cosmetic change. We had a change of faces, but the regimes remained. The nizam remained. So I would go as far as to say, and again, this could be the idealist in me, this could be the romanticist in me, or whatever you want to call it, but it has been done in the past. Gaddafi has done it in the past. Gamal Abdel Nasser has done it in the past. Saddam has done it in the past. A number of Musharraf has done it in the past. A number of rulers have done in the past, where they come and then they do what they need to do to cement their power, right? And I feel that Morsi did not do enough to secure and cement his power in those areas of government and in those areas of power sharing circles that would have safeguarded him from being removed. The fact that he was removed within a year, or within a day or two, that easily showed that the power still remained within SCAF, the military and those who, the secularists and the old guard that remain in power. But we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He makes it easy for our brothers and sisters from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that He releases all our brothers and sisters, the ulama and the activists who are in prison, and that He hastens the release of Dr. Morsi. Ameen. What the brothers and sisters in Ikhwan have been facing in Egypt, and arguably for decades, like other Islamic political movements, it's very sad, right? And these groups have many critics. They have many critics, both within the secular circles and the liberal circles, and within the Islamic circles. But remember, it is these Islamic activists and scholars and movements who the dungeons of the oppressors and the tyrants are filled with. So whilst we sit in the comforts of our lives, not fearing arrest, imprisonment, assassination, that it is members and parties and activists from these groups, not just Ikhwan al-Muslimin and others, who fill the dungeons of the oppressors. And we ask Allah, besides our differences with them, whichever differences you may have, whether they are theological, political, or sectarian, putting those differences aside, we should all pray for the release of all the brothers and sisters who are part of these different movements, who want to make Allah's word reign supreme in the Ummah and in the world. Ameen.
I wanted to ask, because Morsi coming into power and how it didn't end up working out. Like, I was listening to Sam Harris's podcast, his latest season, episode 1. I forgot who the guest was.
You listen to Sam Harris?
No, sorry, not Sam Harris. What was it? The Russell Brand, sorry. So,
okay, Russell Brand.
Yeah,
sorry. I was getting worried then. Joe Rogan, okay. Sam Harris?
The only podcast I listened to Sam Harris was with Maajid Nawaz.
He's a big Maajid Nawaz fan.
No, astaghfirullah, bro. Anyways, Russell Brand, I forgot who he was talking with. He was an Israeli guy. I'm pretty learned and stuff. What I've realized with kind of Western scholars or people in universities, they use the whole Morsi incident as a sort of weapon to be like, okay, this is how implementation of Islam over countries looks like. It causes more harm if you get what I mean. Like, what's your take on that? How should we react, and what's the real reality in regards to the implementation of Islam through democratic system?
That's a huge topic, my dear brother. I can't believe you've raised this right to the end.
That's a bomb.
That's like a massive topic which I think that I have very strong views about. But look, there's this very false understanding within Western academic circles and even Islamic circles that political Islam equals the Muslim Brotherhood, or pro-democratic Islamism means Muslim Brotherhood, or simply Islamism equals Muslim Brotherhood. This is incorrect. The Ikhwan al-Muslimin are not the only political Islamic movement in the Muslim majority world. Yes, they are the oldest and perhaps the largest, but they are not the only political Islamic movement in the Muslim majority world. So we need to stop making this kind of conflation, this equation that political Islam equals Muslim Brotherhood or Islamism equals Muslim Brotherhood. This is not true.
Yeah, I think there's the Jordanian as well. Muslims that are trying to gain power through the democratic system, because Shadi Hamid alluded to it, and he said that through his analysis, it's like Islamists that try to come through the democratic system, they'll always have to compromise on their values and principles anyway.
Look,
or what's your kind of take on
look, let's just take Ghanouchi of An-Nahda in Tunisia, right? He said not too long ago that there is no longer any need for political Islam, that this is finished. He has arguably moved away now from even the kind of pragmatic approach of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the nature of trying to bring about Islamic change through a pluralistic, democratic political system is that naturally there will have to be compromises made. that there naturally has to be an element of power sharing. That there has to be, and there will always be an element of allowing kufr and batil to remain within a system which governs the masses, because this is the nature of a pluralistic liberal democracy, right? Now, I'm not going to go into the kind of theological or the fiqhi or the methodological differences between whether participating in democracy is halal or haram, or bringing Islamic change or implement the Sharia for these systems is it halal or haram. I think we can perhaps dedicate another podcast with brothers and sisters from different movements and thinking to obviously have a more robust discussion. Me personally, I don't believe that Islam can be implemented comprehensively through the democratic system. It's impossible, you know, because the nature of a liberal democracy, or let's just even move away liberal, the nature of democracy, a pluralistic democracy, how it's understood in the Arab or Muslim world, is that there will still be an element of power sharing. There will still have to be an element of making alliances with certain groups to attain power, like we saw with the AK party in the recent Turkish election when they allied with ardent Turkish nationalists, right? Like we saw with Jamaat Islam in Bangladesh when they were in alliance with Bangladesh Nationalist Party, right? We will see these things. So in a system like this, you will never see the implementation of Islam comprehensively. But I would even go as far as to say that you will never see the implementation of Islam in a holistic manner, even in one section of society or government or governance, simply because the system does not allow it. The dynamics, the makeup of the system, how it's built, the regime, the institutions, the foundations upon which the institutions are founded, the laws and everything else which protects and safeguards these institutions, all of these things which makes up the nizam, which makes up the system, will never allow for an ideology or for a worldview or a deen like Islam to rule comprehensively. But for sure, it will allow socialists, it will allow communists, it will allow nationalists, it will allow progressive conservatives, it will allow all the different other groups within different ideological spectrums, political spectrums to rule. That's fine, because essentially they agree, or they've succumbed to the overarching thing of democracy, which is that we will power share and we will compromise. But then to discuss whether Islam can be implemented, via democratic system, this is something which I feel that it's unfair, and I've said this to others. I feel it's unfair discussing this in the absence of someone else from the other side. Because when you speak to brothers and sisters and ulama and activists from the other side, and there are many, many of them, they will say that, look, democracy is shurocracy. Shurocracy is democracy. This kind of post-colonial statist understanding of an Islamic state and having certain laws and etc. Even this is a byproduct of the post-colonial era, right? But if those of you who have studied political theory, the history of democracy, all the way from the Athenian notion of democracy and the Roman notion of democracy, all the way up to how it formed under the newly formed nation states and how it has evolved into what we find ourselves in today. Those who have studied it, and I spent 3 years studying it in my BA, right? Those who have studied the systems of democracy know that such a system is not designed for a completely opposing worldview, one which is founded and dedicated to the divine, to rule comprehensively. It's impossible. It's not going to happen. And I think our brothers and sisters who are engaged and support these kind of methodologies and these kind of understanding, they know this. But the way they see it as, it is better than nothing. It is better than having no Sharia. It is better than having no Islamic party. It is better than having no one who shows an aspiration towards Islam in the public sphere. And that sentiment is something which I cannot knock. It's not something which I can criticize. All I can say is that I think it's incorrect. And I think that this perpetuation of believing that Islam or Sharia or the Islamic systems or Islamic revival will somehow come through a democratic system which is built and well rooted in the institutions of the secular nation state is far-fetched and unrealistic. And if you read the books of John L. Esposito, Wael Halak, as well as others, they speak about this. They speak about this in a lot of detail. That if Islamist groups and parties believe that they can establish an Islamic state around the notion of a nation state, they are going to fail. Halak said this, Esposito said this, Ed Said said this. The three most prominent academics who have spoken about Islamic polity, the nation state, and Islamic revival, they've all said it. They've said that, look, if we take, and I believe even when Mursi fell, Professor Tariq Ramadan, even he wrote in a piece that the political Islam has died. Of course it has died. If you keep on equating political Islam or Islamism with the Muslim Brotherhood or certain parties which fall within that pragmatic approach, then of course it has failed. And it will continue to fail.
Tariq Ramadan.
Halak, have you guys heard of the work or heard of Wael Halak?
No.
And John L. Esposito? Okay. Well, look into Wael Halak's Impossible State. Read Ed Said's book on the Khilafah, and also read John L. Esposito's works on Islamic movements and the nation state, right? Basically, the argument that all three of them, amongst many others, including a Russian academic called Sergei Israpilov, he spoke about it in the context of the Caucasus resistance movement and the Caucasus Islamic Emirate when they were fighting the Russians and the Serbs. Any Islamic group or movement, these guys have argued, and they have kind of based it around the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islam and other like organizations and parties, that if you think that creating an Islamic state, an Islamic nation state, this is impossible. Because the very foundations, the very intricate institutions and the mechanisms which the nation state is founded upon and is built upon, it just will not allow the kind of state that you guys have in mind. It just won't happen. First and foremost, the shackles of the nation state has to be broken. That first and foremost has to be broken. This understanding that the nation state is the first and only thing, and the kind of end of history, as Fukuyama argued with regards to democracy, that notion needs to end, right? We need to remind ourselves that the nation state, the notion of a nation state, is barely 200 years old. And in the case of the Muslim majority world and the developing world, is just about 100 years old, right? And as soon as we, Islamic political movements and groups and thinkers and ulama understand this, understand that the secular nation state does not represent the default. It does not represent the thing that's always been there. No, it's new. And it's unnatural. Just like how we discussed the issue of asabiya and nationalism very early on in the podcast. This notion of the secular nation state is unnatural, brothers. It's unnatural. Academics have argued at great lengths. This new notion of statehood based around subjective notions of nationality and cultural norms, or what's regarded as national norms, it's all bakwas. It's bakwas. It makes absolute sense in the European context and their struggle against the Vatican and Roman Catholicism and the Christian Reformation and all that stuff. Yeah, it makes sense in that context. But in the context of the Muslim majority world and other parts of the developing world, it does not make sense. It's unnatural, right? So for Islamic political movements and parties to think that they will have a state, a nidam, a state, which will be at some point gradually after X amount of years or months or decades, that it will essentially become Islamic through some drip feed, dawah, bottom up kind of stuff. You know, they are mistaken. And if we are going to take those attempts at establishing Islam from a state perspective, then of course, yeah, political Islam has failed. Islamism has failed. If we're going to be taking the case of Egypt and Algeria as examples, or that of even certain parties in Bangladesh and Pakistan and other parts of the Muslim majority world, though I will argue that Turkey is distinctly different to those examples, because Turkey's political, socio-economic and religious dynamics is completely different to the Arab and Indian subcontinent, the Arab world and Indian subcontinent. Their struggle has been entirely different. So when I see what's happening in Turkey, I see it as distinctly different. And when you go and speak, have any of you guys been to Turkey?
No, we haven't. Inshallah, we will when the caliphate's established.
When the Ottomans are back.
No. Go before the Ottomans come. Go before that. Go there and go speak to Turks. And you know when you guys hear these kind of, oh, the brother is a gradualist and these guys are gradualists, let me tell you something. The Turks are the original gradualists. And not in a bad way. These guys, right, and when I say these guys, I'm basing it on the activists, the students, the academics, and the ulama who I had a number of discussions with in my 4 visits to Istanbul and Turkey over the last 2.5 years, is that when they look at the dynamics of the Arab world and the Indian subcontinent, Turkey was not affected by colonialism the way the Arab world and the Indian subcontinent was. You guys acknowledge this? Turkey never had foreign boots on their ground. They never had European boots in their countries, colonizing them, looting them of their resources. They never had that, right? However, in the latter stages of the Ottoman, of the Uthmani Khilafah, the kind of even before the Tanzimat reforms and the Young Turk movement, even before that, European thinking had already entered the Uthmani Khilafah, and he had affected a number of Khulafa and Sultans and key military players. However, Turkey has never experienced European, Western, foreign soldiers, occupiers who usurped their lands and usurped power and looted them. They've never had that. They've been colonized in a different way. It's been more of an intellectual colonization, though that's also taken place in the Arab world and in the subcontinent and Africa as well. But they've not experienced that. Because they've not experienced that, and they had to deal with Kemal Ataturk, who basically implemented a muscular form of secularism literally overnight, their struggle against secularism has been uniquely different to that of the Arab world, the Muslim majority world. So when you speak to even those who are supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey, you'll find that they are not entirely receptive of Sayyid Qutb, rahimahullah, or even the earlier teaching of Hassan al-Banna, rahimahullah. They commend them, they praise them, they appreciate their works. But many of the guys who I spoke to of different different persuasions, they said, look, those works were absolutely appropriate and relevant for those regions. We've not had those experiences. The Turks have not had the experiences of the British and the French coming into our countries, raping our women, taking our money and our oil and our resources, and then leaving a puppet to look to protect their interests. No, we had to deal with a guy who actually fought for the Khilafah in World War I, then fought the Greeks, then assumed power, then implemented his form of muscular secularism overnight, and then cracked down on anything that was remotely Muslim, Islamic, and Ottoman. So our struggle is different. And in that regard, I will give credit to Erdogan and the AK Party and the different Muslim political movements and groups who have played a very gradual role in reintroducing and easing social reforms for Muslims to be more proud about their identity. Right? To have programs such as Dirilish Ertugrul or Yunus Emre 20, 30 years ago was unimaginable. To have the sisters wearing hijab and brothers donning the beard the way you'll see in Istanbul and other parts of the country, it was unimaginable 30, 40 years ago. Wallahi, the struggle of the Turkish brothers and sisters is distinctly different. It is saying that they are also fighting and trying to combat this kind of intellectual colonization of secularism and nationalism. Yes, they are also fighting that in their academic spheres and in their everyday lives. Yeah.
You mentioned Turkey, so it actually links back a lot what we said earlier about Turkey, and if Erdogan is really kind of having his interests lying in the Ummah. But you just mentioned gradualism. Do you feel that the way Erdogan's intent deep down is to bring the Ummah back to its former glory? So the only way he can kind of do it is through gradualism. And you just mentioned how Ertugrul and all these programs couldn't be made like 30 years ago, and now they are. So he's doing it slowly, or do you feel that there's other kind of objectives at play here?
Erdogan and the AK Party, it's virtually impossible for me to kind of even make an assumption on what's in the heart of Mr. Erdogan. I can't make that assumption. But what I can say is that the AK Party have played a key role in the Islamization of Turkish society. I think we can't, anyone who denies that or rejects that is not being honest, right? And you get brothers who'll be like, okay, fine, he's opened up more madrasas and more masajid and more this and that. What is this? This isn't real change. Okay, khair, from one perspective it can be argued, but the point here is we're talking about in a context where in Turkey there was no new building of masajid. There was no adhan in Arabic. Sisters were not allowed to wear their hijab in public buildings and government, etc. Right? And these changes are massive changes for Turks, and it is reconnecting them with their Islamic heritage. But there's one thing that I must mention, right? Those who conflate or attribute this kind of new neo-Ottoman Islamic awakening in Turkey entirely with Erdogan and the AK Party, this is untrue. It's unfounded. How can you rationally attribute the entire awakening, the Islamic awakening of millions of Muslims in Turkey to one man or one party, when the best part of 1,000 years of that country, whether it be the Seljuks or the Ottomans, was heavily influenced by Islam? So this kind of false understanding that Sultan Erdogan and the Ottoman Empire was I've heard this. It's nonsense, right? This popular likening of Erdogan and the AK Party to the Ottoman Empire is a fallacy. This link between Sultan Erdogan and the Ottoman Empire essentially was born out of the reality that for decades Turkey was structurally suppressed from the public recognition of its Islamic heritage, something commonly attributed to the Ottomans and the Seljuks before them. Inevitably, when a seemingly unapologetic Muslim leader like Erdogan emerged from the gradual decline of Kemalism, the logical outcome for many was to liken Erdogan and the AK Party to modern-day Ottomans. I can understand that. And while this comparison to the Ottomans has been parroted by Western journalists and Turkish secularists, and they seem to be the only guys who liken him to like the Ottomans and the Sultans, as well as his supporters as well. By the way, Erdogan AK Party supporters within Turkey never make this comparison to Ottoman sultans. This is something which, for some reason or another, Muslims outside of Turkey tend to make. Comparing Erdogan and the AK Party to the Ottomans, it cannot be substantiated from a political rhetoric point of view, let alone his policies. But this issue of Ottoman nostalgia, it is most certainly undeniably on the rise in Turkey. And during my couple of visits to Turkey in the last 2.5 years, I noticed a consistent level of cross-spectrum positive sentiments towards Ottoman history, whether it be hotel staff, taxi drivers, restaurant waiters, shopkeepers, university students. I literally was speaking to randoms everywhere I went to. And many of these guys who have now positive attitudes about Ottoman history and their heritage, many of them were also ardent critics of Erdogan. So that doesn't make sense either. If Erdogan equals neo-Ottomans, then how is that those who now appear to be proud of Ottomanism happen to be critics of Erdogan? It just doesn't make sense. And on a concluding point regarding Turkey and what's happening within Turkey, whilst it would be incorrect to even figuratively compare Erdogan to the Ottoman sultans and the Khulafa of the past, again, I can't deny that AKP has played a key role in normalizing Ottoman nostalgia in Turkey. And of course, he's even done things like commemorating historical battles like Gallipoli, as well as welcoming world leaders with Ottoman dress guards. And, whilst all this kind of like superficial stuff may be like, meh, what is this stuff? It does resonate with Muslims within Turkey. And it is fair to say that much of Erdogan's rhetoric and AKP's social policies would make Atatürk turn in his grave. It would. And in addition to calling on Muslim youth in Turkey to get married at a young age, urging Muslim married couples to have at least 5 children, as well as this kind of strong rhetoric in support of the Palestinians, the Syrians, the Rohingyas, another indicator of Erdogan and the AK Party's role in reviving Ottoman history is their support for shows like Dirilish Ertuğrul and stuff. So we can't equate at all, in any shape or form, the entire movement and awakening that's taking place within millions of Turks entirely to Erdogan and the AK Party. Some of it is also to the Gulen movement and Erbakan's movement and the other Islamic movements, right? And how could you rationally say that Atatürk was able to single-handedly remove 1,000 years of Islamic heritage from the Turks? No, they maintained their deen and they held their deen in private. And how could you say that Erdogan single-handedly has brought all of it back? Neither makes sense. But Erdogan and AK Party have played a key role. As for his true intentions, Allahu Alam, I can't read his heart. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that whatever comes out of his mouth, he means it, and one day it actualizes into policies and action. But thus far, none of it has.
That also, Erdogan openly emphasizes virtues of democratic and secular form of government as well. So it's not like you can say that, as you just mentioned, that he's full pro, caliphate or whatever kind of line of thinking. But you mentioned a lot earlier, we were discussing, Islam and Islamism and, rising through the democratic system. I actually want to hone in on your kind of local homeboy, Maajid Nawaz, because we hear a lot about him.
The great lion of the Ummah, the bastion of Haqq, that is Maajid Nawaz.
So, and he obviously, from what we can gather, living in Australia, Sydney, he says he's Muslim and he says that, liberalism and secularism is compatible, and that's why he's, started Quilliam. And not only that, he associates himself with other interesting figures like, Sam Harris.
He didn't just say it was compatible, actually, guys. He said it was necessary. Because the Muslim world, needs to be...
Brothers. Look, before we get onto this interesting topic of Najis Nawaz.
Najis Nawaz?
I think it's very important. Brothers, that, there are many Islamic groups and scholars and movements who, through their ijtihad and through their understanding, they do not see democracy as a system of kufr per se, nor its participation, and nor trying to attain power and influence through it. So, when I speak to family and friends and brothers and groups who are very close to me, and they are from that way of thinking, and I would even argue that way of thinking is the status quo. I'd go as far as to say that way of thinking is the majority. And I think that, we do have to respect, not necessarily agree at all, but we do have to kind of accept and respect that work and efforts have been put into this methodology or thinking that democracy as a system is permissible to take part in, permissible to try attain power through, and permissible to try implement the Sharia through. these kind of very deep scholastic fiqh issues. One day, inshallah, I hope we can discuss this on your podcast with brothers or individuals from that way of thinking to make the discussion more. Yeah. I just need to clarify that because trying to equate or trying to normalize Islam or participation in liberal democracy with Islam is the very least of Mr. Nawaz's heretical
Yeah,
views.
and I was going to say that I'm not opposed to the idea of like it's a very 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 complex discussion. I'm not opposed to the idea of participating in democracy, particularly in the West, particularly given complex political climates. I'm not entirely opposed to that, but I suppose it's more. He's a member of the Liberal Democratic Party, I believe, in the United.
Look, my dear brothers, just look. In the UK, we have Muslims who are part of the Conservatives, the Conservative Party. We have Muslims who are part of the Labour Party. We have Muslims who are part of the Liberal Democratic. Heck, we even have Muslims who are part of the UK Independent Party, which is like a right-wing racist party, right? We even have one Pakistani lad from Glasgow who's a member of the English Defence League. Yeah. We even have a Muslim Imam of the armed forces. So again, Maajid Nawaz being part of the Liberal Democrats or was a prospective candidate in his constituency, that's the least of his batil. Maajid Nawaz, for those of you who don't know him, and I pray to Allah that you guys never encounter him or his works, he is someone who was a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir. He was quite outspoken and very well known within Hizb ut-Tahrir. He went to Egypt with two other members from the Hizb. They were arrested for espionage and trying to overthrow the government, I believe. And they spent 3.5 years in Egyptian prisons. In the prisons, Amnesty regarded them to be prisoners of conscience, and through a number of lobbying and intervention of human rights groups, Maajid Nawaz and the two other brothers from the Hizb, they were released. Upon their release, Maajid Nawaz was still a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir. He spoke at one of their conferences. He spoke at one of the big demos. But then he went on to, I believe, BBC Newsnight, where they did a special exclusive report of a former Islamist who had kind of had an epiphany and awoken to the mistakes and the flaws of his former way of thinking. And then he came out, and this was his first public kind of renouncing of political Islam and Hizb ut-Tahrir and the notion of khilaf and all this kind of stuff. And he basically said that, look, what I was upon was very hateful, was very divisive, it was very toxic. And whilst I still believe that the oppressive rulers must be accounted and removed, this methodology and what I was upon was absolutely wrong. It was un-Islamic, it's very divisive, and it's problematic. That was his first public statement. Then from there on, it just went from batil to open kufr. And I mean, he is someone who has openly admitted that he consumes alcohol. He is someone who has publicly said that he gambles. He was 2 years or 2.5 years ago in Ramadan. He was found filmed in a strip club, drunk, trying to harass and grope a strip dancer. But yani, these are all private things which he happily has publicized. But this kind of notion that there is no such thing as an Islamic government, there's no such thing as an Islamic caliphate, there's no such thing as capital punishment for the one who publicly apostatizes in an Islamic government and after due process remains upon that position. There is no punishment for the one who commits sodomy in public after 4 eyewitnesses have seen the act of penetration in an Islamic government or in an Islamic state. There is verses of the Quran which are outdated. The story of Lut alayhi salam only applies to criminality and male rape, not homosexuality. that the rules pertaining to inheritance between men and women has to be revised so it's gender equal, that was contextual to that time. This entire narrative of historicizing the Quran, saying that certain ayat of the Quran are outdated or needs revisiting or needs new commentary. Yeah, he is upon all of that. And that's not to mention his nefarious links to the Tea Party movement, to the white conservatives, to the right-wing groups, to Zionists who fund his organization, who pay his salary. That's not to mention his obsession with persisting that Muslim women should not wear the niqab, Muslim women should not wear the hijab, Muslim girls should not wear the hijab. Yet he has absolutely no problem paying 10, 20 pounds to a half-naked stripper drunk in Ramadan. But he wants to see our sisters without their hijab and their niqab. He's all for free speech. He's all for free speech and religious freedom until a Muslim advocates for the Sharia in the Muslim majority world via peaceful means. He's all for free speech until a Muslim says that he believes that homosexuality is an abomination. So Maajid Nawaz, his organization Quilliam Foundation, who also has another nefarious individual called Dr. Osama Hassan, who was a very prominent Salafi speaker in the 90s, who is the son of Sheikh Suhaib Hassan, the prominent Salafi scholar of the UK, who I had a debate with on BBC Sunday Morning Live. You can just Google Dilly Hussain,
I've seen that. That was the first time.
right? Where he said that, you can shorten your fasts to whatever your body tells you until it's hard, until and then I had to tell him live on TV that Allah's mercy and justice is greater than your progressive thinking. And if you call me an extremist for believing this, then look into a scholar called Sheikh Suhaib Hassan, your father, who believes in the Sharia, who believes in not shortening the fast, who believes in Khilafah, who believes in jihad, who believes in the very things that you and your organization go and you go and label other Muslims as extremists and threat to the British establishment. The very same things which you label others for, your dad believes in. This is pertaining to Dr. Osama Hassan. And I hope he listens to this. And I hope that if you're going to label and you're going to provide the media and the police and venues with lists of organizations, of speakers and du'at and ulama and activists to no platform us, that your father's name must be included in this list as well. And this is the kind of stuff that these guys do in Quilliam Foundation. They normalize kufr. They don't even normalize shad opinions. It's not even about that anymore. They literally normalize kufr, right? Under this umbrella of free progressive thinking, that universal human rights dictates all. Times have changed. And because times have changed, the Quran has to change, right? Because times have changed, the default isn't the age of empires and religious scriptures. Universal human rights, Islam has to conform to this, that Islam has to undergo a reformation like Christianity did. Literally, these guys have said this. Maajid Nawaz has come number of times live on TV and said that Islam is yet to undergo a liberal secular reformation which harmonizes Islam and its scripture away from medieval dogma. So Najas Nawaz, believing that liberal democracy is okay, that Muslims should fight, is the least of the very least, because God-fearing, pious, devout Muslims believe this. So that's nothing. Him being part of the Liberal Democrats is nothing either, because we have Muslims who are part of other political parties and the British Armed Forces and even Zionist lobbies, right? What makes the Quilliam Foundation and others like Sarah Khan, this women's rights activist who was formerly part of We Inspire, but now she is the Commissioner for Countering Extremism. She dedicated 7 pages to 5 pillars, and myself, respect to her. Fiaz Mughal from Faith Matters, right? Dilwar Hussain, not me. Dilwar Hussain from an organization called New Horizons of British Islam. Quilliam Foundation. All these guys, they make up what is known as the deformist movement within the UK. Some of these guys were formerly with the Hizb, others were ex-Salafis, others were from IFE or Jamaati Islam, others were from Deobandi backgrounds, but the most prominent of these deformists is obviously Maajid Nawaz, who was formerly with the Hizb. There's another irrelevant non-entity, but I'm sure I'll give him a shout out because it'll give him a bit of a sense of self-importance. It's a guy called Rashad Ali. He was also formerly with the Hizb, but he's a full-time charlatan. There's Dr. Osama Hassan, who is very well versed in Islamic theology and the Quran and stuff like this. He debated Yasir Qadhi on evolution. He was obviously a former Salafi. Dilwar Hussain is a Bengali academic, but he's also upon this kind of reformist agenda. And literally, what these guys want to do, I mean, they have taken it a step further. It's not even about now Muslims not calling for Sharia or Muslims not wanting X, Y, and Z services in the UK. They are literally about changing Islam top to bottom. Everything that is remotely orthodox, they want to change this. Whether it be gender relations, whether it be the capital punishments and the penal code, whether it be the political concepts within Islam, whether it be the notion of jihad, whether it be the notion of a khilafah. They want to change the issue of men and allowing 4 wives. They want to change inheritance laws. They want to change the way women dress. They literally want to change so many forms of normative Islam, which has been part of our tradition for 1400 years. These are just some of the things, brothers, that I've mentioned. Like these guys, Maajid Nawaz and others, they've come on live TV. I mean, he's come to Australia even, and they've come live on TV and they said, "Look, man, we're secular liberals, and we're silenced, we're censored. If you give us a voice, we will eventually become the mainstream, but we're silenced because the Islamists and the Salafists and the conservatives, they're so loud." These guys could not hide their opposition to mainstream Islam. That first they began with the Hizb, the Salafis, the Muslim Brotherhood type movements and charities, then the Deobandis, then they went after the Sufi Barelvis as well, saying that this notion of Gustaki Rasul, this notion that you can't curse the Prophet ﷺ, yeah, this is backward and medieval and is proliferating violence and normalizing violence. These guys have, first and foremost, they have absolutely no following or support within the grassroots in the United Kingdom. In fact, there's a saying that if you guys ever visit the UK, you may hear this. There are 2 things which unite all groups of Muslims in the United Kingdom. That's Israel and Quilliam Foundation. And that's all I have to say about these guys.
I remember there was when Maajid Nawaz was in jail. There was that he was in jail with someone. That guy, he came out of jail. He was pro caliphate. I forgot his name. I think it was Penfound or something. One of them, I think.
It was brother Dr. Reza Pankhurst.
Yeah, Pankhurst. He was like
Dr. Reza Pankhurst, and it was our brother Yahya Nesbit. MashaAllah, both our brothers, they remained very steadfast upon the deen. Brother Yahya Nisbet, he's the media spokesman of Hizb ut-Tahrir Britain. Dr. Reza Pankhurst, he's published 2 books on Islamic political movements and the challenges of establishing a khilafah in the 21st century. He was a lecturer at King's College, I believe. These guys remained steadfast upon their dawah, and alhamdulillah, they progressed and remained leaders within their respective circles. But obviously Maajid Nawaz obviously didn't. And these guys, they live for their egos. These guys, narcissism is something which I would argue, many people in the public arena has to have a level of ego and narcissism. But alhamdulillah, those who are God-fearing and have a consciousness and awareness, they try to obviously, tackle that and address that. But guys like Maajid Nawaz, these guys live for TV interviews. They live for newspaper splashes. They live, like Maajid Nawaz has a radio show on LBC, Leading Britain's Conversation. It's one of the biggest radio stations in the UK. And every week, he's talking about Islamists, Muslim women, hijab, niqab. He is always slating the deen of Islam and Muslims. And like I said, the Quilliam Foundation, Maajid Nawaz, Sarah Khan, her Commission for Countering Extremism, Fiaz Mughal and Faith Matters, Dilwar Hussain and New Horizons, and that joker Rashad Ali, all of these guys, they are non-entities. Wallahi, they are non-entities. Come and walk the streets of any major city and town in the UK which has big Muslim populations, whether it's my hometown of Bedford, Luton, London, Manchester, Birmingham, all those big major towns and cities up north and the Midlands. They either do not know who these guys are or they reject them like the Dajjal. Alhamdulillah. These guys are nobodies. But they have such massive platforms. Sorry. Just one last point. These guys, they have such massive platforms. But look at the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That these guys, Quilliam Foundation and others and their ilk, they have access to all the national newspapers. They are nearly invited to every single, primetime news show. Yet, with all that platform, with all that resources, they still remain barely in the peripheries. Barely. Like even that is giving them too much. And this is a blessing from Allah. That these guys, with the little resources that Muslim groups and movements have, whether it be our Facebook pages or our Twitter accounts or our blogs or whatever we have, alhamdulillah, we are still loved and respected and received with warmth and accountability from the Ummah and our communities here. Right? Whereas these guys, with all their access, they've not made any progress in what they claim to have. They love the money, they love themselves, and they love hearing their own voices, and they love hearing what their masters in Downing Street say to them. They're chaiwalas. These guys are colonial tea-boys. That's what they are. So they're just on a very good payroll.
I agree, because even before Maajid Nawaz, became very liberal and secular, even with the Hizb, apparently the Hizb wouldn't give him leadership positions because they saw in him traits of, wanting that spotlight. And essentially, even the problem becomes where, like, for example, for liberal kind of non-Muslims that just want to go about life and, secular in their view, they see Maajid Nawaz as appealing, right? So when you get a guy or a devout Muslim kind of talking against Maajid Nawaz, they suddenly assume that you're against, freedom and, having rights or anything. And suddenly they paint this view that Islam is very backward naturally because you're talking against someone, because they idolize Maajid Nawaz to the point where, okay, he represents all the values of the West. And I guess, I don't think Muslims hate, if you kind of take into account what Islam has to say and what the West has to say. Obviously, there are differences, but for the most part, we do want to get on with life. We
have to get on with life.
Yeah, exactly. So when essentially you have Maajid Nawaz appealing or talking about those values of the West, and then someone like me or even yourself come along and a non-Muslim sees that they're vehement against Maajid Nawaz's discourse.
But Maajid Nawaz tells people that anyone who's against him, who holds very normative, like quote unquote moderate Islamic views, even, is an extremist and is partisan to groups such as.
People are beginning to start seeing through that. That may have been the case in the early days, and yeah, he has his core supporters who are of not just a liberal background, but a very muscular liberal background. And the vast majority of Quilliam Foundation supporters are not actually liberals. It's the right wing. It's It's the right wingers. Yeah, it's the conservatives, the right wingers, the white supremacists. Those are the core of his supporters. But yes, within amongst them, you also get white liberals. However, what you have to understand is, yes, once they're constantly hearing Maajid Nawaz and his ilk and others, and obviously amongst them as well, you've got this other thing where the British government and the press love normalizing the Qadiani movement in the UK as well. They love doing that as well, like
I've seen that as well here.
like presenting them as like the model Muslim community. But look, non-Muslims who have grown up with Muslims, with Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian, Arab, Turkish, Kurdish, black neighbors who happen to be Muslim, they know what Muslims believe in and what they don't believe in. They know that their neighbors or their friends, their peers, or whatever it may be, are not what Maajid Nawaz says. However, there are huge numbers of non-Muslims who have never really interacted with Muslims on an everyday basis. They haven't. And it is those guys who have and can easily be influenced by what Maajid Nawaz says. Because essentially, when he's talking about freedom of speech, freedom of sexuality, universal human rights, progressive thinking, and all that kind of stuff is ticking all the right boxes for the liberal. However, once they start realizing that, hold up, this guy Majid and his friends, they are actually not just a minority, literally they just seem to be a handful of people. What then happens is that those non-Muslims will go on to research, and I've met non-Muslims who have done this, by the way. I've met non-Muslims who said, you know what, we used to listen to this guy called Maajid Nawaz. I know what, we thought he was fantastic. Everything that he was saying in his radio show on the TV, I agreed with everything. Until I realized that he actually is rejected by everyone in the Muslim community, and his organization has absolutely no has no say in the grassroots perspective, from the grassroots level in the Muslim community. And when we found out why, we found out that these guys are essentially just peddling what the government is telling them, because it's the government that pays their salaries, right? But yes, they have a core and growing number of liberal, white, non-Muslim supporters, because essentially they are saying what essentially they believe in as their aqidah and their worldview and their way of life. However, if you continue having Muslim activists, writers, thinkers, du'at, who have opportunities on their platforms and mainstream platforms to convey the compassionate, merciful, and comprehensive perspective of Islam, then inshallah the likes of Maajid Nawaz and Quilliam Foundation will never ever make edgeway in the Muslim community in the UK or anywhere else in the world. So, because the way I see it as, if with all their resources and their accesses, this is how little they've achieved, and with the little in terms of resources that the Muslim groups have, the different Muslim groups have in the UK, and the amount we've managed to achieve and preserve and protect, alhamdulillah, if we carry on with this kind of ratio, Quilliam will be finished. Quilliam are dead. They don't exist. Quilliam Foundation and Maajid Nawaz and these guys, they don't exist in the Muslim community. They never have, they never will. They don't exist in the Muslim community. I'm still waiting to know a single mosque in the last 10 years that has hosted them for an event. I don't know a single mosque that has invited. We have more than 1,500 mosques in the United Kingdom, right? Not a single one has hosted Maajid Nawaz or the Quilliam Foundation, right? Because as soon as he probably sends his the first sentence he'll utter, there'll probably be an uncle with his bata sandals or his singla chasing him out. It won't happen. It just won't happen.
How we deal with it.
You understand? So these guys, they don't exist in the Muslim community. They exist to feed on the fears of our non-Muslim neighbors and our friends and our colleagues. That's what they survive and live for. They survive and live to peddle a particular narrative which demonizes and criminalizes Islam and Muslims. They survive and their existence as it stands is solely to present Islam and its adherents in a particular light, to perpetuate this fear and suspicion of Islamophobia that non-Muslims already have about Muslims. Those who have never met Muslims or interacted with them. And this is what they're there for. They're not here for the Ummah. They're not here for the community. They never have been. They never have been. They're there for news shows, sound bites, the media, to go and speak in parliament and having secret meetings with their paymasters, providing lists, blacklists of Muslim organizations and figures to media outlets not to invite them on. You know they do this? They provide lists to the police. They provide lists to media outlets and say, you know what, don't invite these people. Don't platform these guys. Don't give them a venue. They're Islamists. They're extremists. They believe in this. They don't, they don't. Their thinking and their ideology is no different to ISIS and Al Qaeda. This is what these guys do for a living. This is how they make their earning. I don't know how they sleep at night. But
And what I realize is that, sorry to cut you off, to add to what you just said. I realized that they're always in their own echo chamber. So Maajid Nawaz would go on to, Sam Harris podcast because Sam Harris has such a big following. They'll have their own conversation about Islamism, and then Maajid Nawaz will just state, "Oh, I had this chat with this, Muslim who's high in the community, high ranks in the community, and I was able to turn him over to Quilliam." Like, there's no real actual dialogue
Nonsense, he's
with.
never mentioned their name. These are imaginary friends that he's had, probably from when he's had a strong session the night before. He's imagining people.
And he's pretty much like, I haven't seen him ever dialogue, with someone within, Hezbollah Tahrir, for example, or do an actual dialogue or a debate or anything. And even it's so weird, like, because I see a lot of media that comes out of UK. There's all these weird debates. I remember there was like, is Islam a peaceful religion? And Hirsi Ali and Maajid Nawaz was there. It was like these weird guests they have that are pro-Islam. I don't know.
You see, the thing is they never get like someone like TJ Winter, Abdul Hakim Murad. Like, you don't see these like big giants of the Muslim community and of like Muslim intellectuals. Like, it's always this straw manning,
and it's echo chamber. They get like people they think should represent Islam. It's like a agenda.
No, but the likes of Abdul Hakim Murad and Sheikh Akram Nadwi and others, these guys are not media people. And I don't believe, from my understanding, from knowing their students and people close to them, I don't think they are people who liken media attention. However, just to address a point that you mentioned, the reason why you've never seen Maajid Nawaz on a platform with anyone else is because, generally speaking, there's a no platform policy that a number of Muslim groups have with the Quilliam Foundation. Me appearing on the BBC Sunday Morning live show with Osama Hassan happened to be a coincidence, which I found out on the day. Many Muslim groups and movements in the UK, they refuse to share a platform with Quilliam Foundation.
Okay, that's good because it kind of disassociates from them.
Especially Maajid Nawaz. But that said, there have been, I believe, Abdullah Andalusi, our dear brother Abdullah Andalusi, he's had a brief interaction with Maajid Nawaz on a show that came on BBC Three. The Muslim Council of Britain, which is on paper the largest umbrella organisation in the UK, their media spokesman Miqdad Varsi, he shared a platform and spoke with Maajid Nawaz on Channel 4. It wasn't a great interview, to be honest. Though brother Miqdad Varsi does do great work in correcting Islamophobic headlines in the newspapers. That particular interview he did with Maajid Nawaz on Channel 4 wasn't great at all. But so there may be one or two organizations who share platforms with Quilliam Foundation. It's even got to the extent where the mainstream media, and I've heard this many times, that they will not even tell the other Muslim spokesperson or contributor that they've got someone from Quilliam until the day, or until just before the show starts. And many brothers and sisters have walked away. They're like, no, thank you.
I think this is going to be one of our biggest episodes as well. And Raf's got a cricket game he's got to go to soon. But regardless, I think this episode was really insightful because it gives people, Muslims that aren't in tune with political events, a taste of what's going on. And obviously, someone like yourself, who is a journalist, shared his insights into Syria, Turkey, because everyone, like a normal lay Muslim, will see, especially in the West, will see Turkey as a beacon of Islamic hope in the Ummah. And also touching on Maajid Nawaz, who's very prominent. So we've touched on caliphate and democratic system and all this kind of stuff, Muslim brotherhood. So I think it's a really jam-packed but very beneficial episode. But regardless, Jazakallah khair, Dilly Hussain, for coming on Boys in the Cave. I hope you enjoyed this Bengali brothers with you today.
I loved it. Wallahi, I was honored. I was honored. I am, after I finish this podcast, I'm going to go get some shupari and pan and chawan baha and munch on that. I really enjoyed it. Wallahi, it was a very, very good podcast. I apologize to you guys if I just went on one and started talking and if I interrupted you guys. To my brothers and sisters who did tune into this podcast, um, if at any point you felt that I was unfair or criticized particular movements or groups or ways of thinking unfairly, please forgive me for the sake of Allah. There are brothers and sisters and ulama and du'at and activists who I differ with and disagree with on many issues, but I love them for the sake of Allah. They're some of the most sincerest and devout Muslims I've ever known. And you know what? I love you guys for the sake of Allah. Even the issues we were discussing about Ikhwan al-Muslimin and the democratic system and those kind of stuff, some of my closest friends and family and loved ones are from those movements and that line of thinking. I think that we need to come to a time, just my concluding statement would be this: we need to get to a stage, hopefully, and I do see this happening, that Muslim groups and movements, we need to be able to share our thoughts, especially those areas which we disagree with, and engage with one another as brothers, right? And engage with one another to appreciate fully our standpoints and our positions. And sometimes certain differences have to be put aside for the sake of a greater cause. And I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He unites our hearts and our minds and our actions for His pleasure, for His deen, inshallah.
I mean,
Before I wrap it up, I almost forgot. We usually ask this question to our guests, and it's pretty insightful to get people's opinions. You probably know yourself. Before the episode, you mentioned you've had chats with local people in Sydney. Like we're very close with Faraz, Uthman, and a lot of brothers in around Sydney. I've all asked them, if you had
Lakemba massive. Lakemba massive.
Subhanallah. If you had to chill in a cave with three other people in history, excluding Rasul Sallam and the Sahaba, because everyone will pick them anyway, who would it be? It can be three people in history, and would like your answers to be more in line with your expertise. It could be in politics or someone that you've read, or a journalist, for example. Could be.
Oh man, what? Hold on. How are you going to ask me a question like that? You're right. Come on, man. So hold on. Three people to be on a podcast with, yeah, from any time in history, yeah.
Not. It could be a podcast, but ideally, just to hang out in a cave.
stuck in a cave with three people. Who would it be?
Okay, in a cave. Okay. Hold on. Look. I get excited with these kind of hypothetical scenarios, which are just relax. What? Any time in history, do they have to be Muslim? Tell me, it can't be that wide in general,
You
surely.
just inspire you, and you just want to talk to endlessly. Like you keep talking and talking, go from the experience, the knowledge.
Okay. I would definitely want to be in the cave with Sultan Abdul Hamid, rahimahullah. I would also like to be in the cave with so Sultan Abdul Hamid. Who else would I want?
Dory, this is literally the hardest question. We always get this.
Why? No, hold on. Sultan Abdul Hamid, without a shadow of a doubt, because his reign and the period he ruled the Khilafah was one of the most challenging times, and what he achieved and what he prevented with the permission of Allah was truly astounding. It's crazy what he managed to safeguard and protect at a time of external and internal warfare and opposition. Sultan Abdul Hamid, and then who else? This is difficult, brothers. Why do you not do this to me?
Mate,
God,
How about
am I
Rabindranath Tagore? I'm kidding.
no.
It could be.
I'm thinking. I'm even thinking that is there a woman that I have to include for the sake of a diversity quota, or no,
Feminists.
no, no. Okay. 100%. And I'm not just saying this, and I don't want people to think, oh, he's just saying this because Dilly towards the end of the podcast is playing a bit of a white knight. No, I would love to spend, obviously within the boundaries of the Sharia, with Emmeline Pankhurst,
Oh, okay.
the famous British feminist who blew up houses and put herself in front of a horse carriage, the radical feminist who played a key role in female emancipation. Obviously, within the boundaries of Sharia, I would like to share some thoughts with her. Maybe not in the cave, maybe outside the cave, or something. So Emmeline Pankhurst. In fact, a discussion between Emmeline Pankhurst and Sultan Abdul Hamid would be so interesting. Wow, that'd be crazy as well.
One more for the cave.
Adolf Hitler.
Ooh. Just to get his views about morality, like what made you?
He's pretty much the most famous person in modern history, I guess. It'd be pretty cool.
I have my reasons. I need to speak.
Well,
No, listen. No, I'm being serious. So yes, okay, there you go. So Sultan Abdul Hamid, Emmeline Pankhurst, and Adolf Hitler. But there are so many others, yani. You know, there's Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, there's Nuruddin al-Zengi, yani, there's Ertugrul, Ghazi, there's Sultan Osman, there's Aurangzeb, there's so many guys that I would have spent time with. Richard the Lionheart. I would love to have spent time with Gianfranco Rousseau. You know, there's so many. I can't believe you guys stung this on me right at the end of the podcast. Man. I can't believe it. I can't believe it.
I think that was
But
I
yeah.
think those most unique answers we've probably gotten.
most unique cave we've ever had on Boys in the
Unique,
Cave.
yeah, very
100%.
diverse group.
What, my one?
Feminist, a caliph, and the fascist walk into a cave.
That should be a joke.
No. But if you think about it, look, let me just explain what it is, right? Because obviously, Emmeline Pankhurst, I believe, was kind of around the same time as Khalif Abdul Hamid. She would have certainly known who the Ottomans were, and Sultan Abdul Hamid would have certainly known about the growing feminist movement in the surrounding areas. And Hitler, I just have some questions for you.
I just have to have a chat with him.
Yeah, I just need to know what the blood fire he was thinking. Like, just mad. But yes, there you go, man. Adolf Hitler, Khalif Abdul Hamid, rahimahullah, and Emmeline Pankhurst. I think Emmeline Pankhurst, if given dawah, could have become Muslim. Adolf, I'm not sure about. But Hidayah is with Allah, of course, and they're gone now, so whatever. But yeah, that's my three people in a cave. Maybe Emmeline needs to come with a chaperone or something. Yeah.
SubhanAllah. And what's your favorite Bengali food?
My favorite Bengali food is this curry that my mom makes. I call it beri di kablisana. So basically, it's chickpeas with lamb. That's my favorite curry. I also love this new thing that they've got in the UK. I don't know if you guys are growing up in Australia. It's called Mr. Naga. It's Naga paste. You know Naga marcha, Naga maris.
Nagamuris,
Yeah. So they've got this paste out now. Yeah, it's called Mr. Naga. I generally add that to all my curries. I love it. But the actual curry that I love, we call it kablisana. Now, kablisana just literally means chickpeas, but it's the curry, very di kablisana. Obviously, I love the classic lamb chop and aloo curry. Yeah, but I don't want to disappoint you guys. Yeah, I don't eat fish.
Astaghfirullah. Brother, what's going on?
I know. But look, I make up for it by having chapati and bun. And for like 4 years, I never brushed my teeth before sleep, and I used to go to sleep with chapati and bun in my mouth. Wow. How much more Bengali can you get than that?
That's like back in Bangladesh when they like hang out. That's their go-to bun, and get that, spray that tobacco on, not spray but sprinkle it on and just munch it. But my grandmother.
But let me tell you something.
Finished. It's like
My dad My dad, he said to me once when I came on TV, he said, Tor dad dekhiya ginna hore. It's disgusting looking at your teeth on TV. He goes, and do you think that people look at your teeth? He goes, Manushalahan dad tik horiskiya. He goes, go sort your teeth out. It's nasty. Yeah? Then obviously after I got married, shout out to my better half, Mahbooba Hussain. She'd be listening to this. She's probably listening to it from the next room. She said, look, John, you need to address your teeth. It's red. It's stained, right? So then I went to the dentist and I got it addressed. And I look, Mr. Hussain, with the amount of betel nut and betel leaf that you're eating, there's a high possibility that you could get mouth cancer. As soon as I heard that, I stopped eating barn. That was in 2014. I started again last year, and it's been bad. Like after every meal, I'm having shapari, and basically I have the leaf, I have the nut, and then I have this thing called chaman baha. It's beautiful. I love it. So I'm gonna have to whiten my teeth again.
It's not like
So I make up for not. So I make up for not eating ilisha and romas and fabiamas and tenga and hutki, shutki, all of that. I make up for it by eating ban and shapari, I guess. So I preserve my Bengali heritage in that way, I guess.
not colonized just yet, alhamdulillah.
No, alhamdulillah.
But yeah, I think it's a beautiful way to wrap it up. But for our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at info@boysinthecave.com or find us on Facebook. And we have a website. We've had it for some time now. Probably didn't mention it's boysinthecave.com. You can, donate there. You can check us out on Patreon if you want to support this podcast. We have some really big news, and we've got equipment upgrade. We're going to be using it in the later future. So definitely you'll see our extra donations coming into good use. And if you want to do a lump sum, we got PayPal as well. And give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, as that greatly helps us. And pretty much from our special guests, Dilly, Josh, Rafael, and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.